lovers with a bond that seemed unbreakable.
They had known each other since they were kids. Very tight-knit families.
They'd been together for a number of years, had 3 children together.
She was excited about the new life she was embarking on.
Until one of them is ambushed after a night out with friends.
Please, help her! Help her!
He said she had been shot by an intruder.
It was very difficult to understand how somebody can do something like that to another individual.
Investigators chased down a variety of leads.
He and his wife have had several run-ins with this individual, and they call him the ketchup man.
He used to say little fly stuff like, I murdered it.
And multiple suspects.
She had actually started seeing someone else on the side.
She said something about deleting her messages so she won't get caught up.
Until they uncover a plot so evil, no one can believe it's true.
It's not just a love triangle gone bad. It is very personal.
And just be looking and get your innocence stated.
It's just like a ticking time bomb. Everything just pointed to this is gonna happen at some point, but when?
February 3rd, 2019, Waco, Texas. It's a chilly night in the Bible Belt town known for its warm hospitality and conservative values.
Waco is a small family town. It's between Austin and the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Our crime rate is actually relatively low for our population.
But just before dawn, Waco police are en route to a home on the south side of town.
They received a panicked 911 call about a shooting.
When first responders arrive moments later, the homeowner, Quest Jones, is frantic and pleading for help.
You can hear somebody screaming their head off.
Help her! Hey, help her! Hey, bud. Help her! Hey, bud. Help her! Help her, please! Please, help her! Please! Help her!
He was saying that his wife, Sherelle, had been shot by an intruder.
Look, went to the bed. Okay, hold on. I'm in the house. No, I took my kids across the street.
Okay, let's step outside.
Police had to detain him and place him in handcuffs and put him in the back of the car to keep him calm while they surveyed the scene.
The officers go into the home because he's made it very clear something horrible has gone on.
Police cautiously move through the house, searching for Sherelle.
There's a back bedroom with lights on. The officers make their way to it after clearing various rooms on the way.
They get to the back bedroom and they see a young woman lying on the floor covered in blood.
The authorities rush to her aid, but almost immediately, they realize they're too late.
They attempt to render first aid, but it is to no avail. She is already dead.
She's been shot multiple times, including 2 times in the head.
Hey, y'all might just want to bring the bag.
Yeah.
26-year-old mother of 3, Sherelle Carter, was known for a dynamic personality that energized everyone around her.
She'd do anything for anybody. She was a loving person with a big, beautiful smile. Every time you see her, she always smiling, just always, lovable, goofy.
Sherelle Carter was from Mejia, Texas, a little small town about 40 miles east of Waco.
And from a young age, there was one person that always gravitated towards Sherelle's bubbly personality.
Sherelle and Quest had known each other since they were kids.
They met at school or around town. I didn't think it was that serious.
But as the years passed, the young couple's bond deepened, and eventually they moved in together.
They were never officially married, but it was like they were. Quest would always refer to Sherelle as his wife.
Soon, Sherelle and Quest decided to grow their family and had 3 children together.
She was ready to be that mother. It's like she this big sister to her kids, play, run around, chase them, and then she'll switch it over to the mother. So it's like her and her kids were so close.
Sherelle's loving nature was a perfect fit for a career in social work, and she thrived at her job at an assisted living home for seniors.
Just a hard-working person. She go hard for her and her kids.
Meanwhile, Quest had a job as a welder.
By 2018, with 3 kids under 5 and full-time jobs, Sherelle and Quest decided they needed more support.
They had moved to Waco with her 3 kids to be closer to family.
On the off days, she'll come and jump in the bed with me and like, Mom, what we gonna do today? I'm like, girl, I want to rest. You know, she just outgoing. She stayed on the go.
But just 2 months later, Sherelle has been gunned down inside her new Waco home.
While first responders are waiting for backup, they cleared the house.
Apparently, we have his kids over at one of these houses.
There were 3 children in the home when the incident happened. They had been brought across the street to the neighbor, and so I made sure that, like, okay, let's get the kids up to the police department. Let's get in contact with Sherelle's family.
First responders then shift their focus to Quest to try to calm him down and see what happened.
Is she okay? She okay?
He kept asking about if we were able to save Sherelle. He kept asking, like, what her condition was.
When they let him know that Sherelle is dead, Quest is completely devastated.
He starts blaming himself for what happened.
What a freeze ball. What made me freeze? That's not me freezing up head first. What made me freeze?
He is completely distraught. He's very emotional.
But despite his emotional state, Quest has an important piece of information for police.
He's able to tell them that he caught sight of the killer when they fled.
After moving to Waco, Texas with her beautiful family of 5, 26-year-old Sherelle Carter was looking forward to being closer to extended family.
Sherelle just recently moved to Waco so that she could have more support from her mom. She was excited about the new life she was embarking on.
But now, Sherelle's promising new home is a crime scene.
Unfortunately, after starting fresh in a new city, she has been gunned down.
And as homicide detectives begin their investigation into the brutal murder, other officers are tasked with delivering the devastating news to Sherelle's mother, only a few blocks away.
I heard a bang, bang on the door, and I'm like, ooh, who is this? And he like, is Sherelle Carter your daughter? And I'm like, yes, what is it? What's going on?
We have some news that I'm sure is going to be a little disturbing to you. I'm going to need you to be able to pick up your grandkids.
Oh my God, okay.
He said, your daughter been murdered tonight.
She's been killed. I know, it's okay.
The kids are safe.
The kids were asleep when the crime took place. Fortunately, they didn't witness what happened.
Ooh, that was a terrible day. Oh, my heart was so crushed, broken, scattered.
As officers prepare to reunite Freda with her grandchildren, investigators at the crime scene are still searching for answers.
Quest calmed down enough at that point to start to say to officers what had happened.
Quest says he spent most of the evening in Mahia, Texas.
He explains that he and Sherelle had both been in Mahia earlier, but they weren't together.
She went to a club. I was out. I went to.
So y'all went to do different places?
Yes.
After returning to Waco, Quest picked up the kids, while Sherelle stayed in Mahia with her friends.
Me and my kids came back way before her.
Quest says after putting the kids to bed, he waited up for Sherelle, who didn't return home until after 3 a.m.
He goes outside in the front yard after Sherelle Carter arrived home from the club that night. They had some interaction, but it was clear that Sherelle was relatively intoxicated.
He says that Sherelle went in to take a shower. He went out on the porch to smoke a cigarette.
But Quest says a few moments later, he heard 5 loud bangs inside the house.
So I'm thinking, what the fuck is on here? I thought it was the TV in the living room.
Quest says when he ran inside to investigate the noise, he was met with a horrific sight.
He rushed in, found Sherelle with multiple gunshot wounds.
But just as he was going to help her, Quest says he realized someone else was in the room.
An unknown intruder comes out and confronts him with a firearm.
Quest stated it was a black male who had on a black hoodie, and the hoodie was tied up around his face so you could only see his eyes.
And I was just shocked, like, just stunned, like, hey, he's going to my house.
Quest says the intruder pulled the trigger, but instead of firing, the gun only clicked.
Because he had to cock the mother, or whatever it was. He was trying to gun me down.
It dry fires, and then the intruder runs past him.
He said that the intruder ran out the back door.
Unfortunately, because of the hoodie covering the man's face, Quest can't give the investigators a very good physical description of the shooter.
I could see his eyes. I could see his eyes.
However, Quest is able to describe the gun the man was using.
Quest stated that the killer had a small caliber handgun because of the small sounds that it made when it was firing.
That's a pistol.
Pistol?
Small.
Once Quest finishes his story, officers transport him back to police headquarters to await further questioning. Meanwhile, investigators take a closer look inside the home.
They start to canvass the house for other items of evidence. Is there sign of forced entry? Are doors, drawers, and things turned over? Are there things clearly missing from the home?
There is no sign of forced entry. And that's odd, considering that this is an attempted burglary.
But for everyone on the scene, one thing immediately stands out.
We've got TVs blasting at absolute full volume to the point you can barely hear the officers speaking to each other.
Police investigators also noticed that the showers were running in the restroom.
It makes sense since Quest said that Sherelle was about to get in the shower when all of this occurred. But detectives are very confused about the TVs.
Investigators also note that for a house that was allegedly being burglarized, the residence is in pretty tidy shape.
The house was pretty intact. There was nothing that was stolen or missing or out of place.
But the primary bedroom where Sherelle was killed tells an entirely different story.
The only part of the house that had any type of disarray was the bedroom where Sherelle was killed.
I could see that this was an up close and personal shooting. I could also see that there were things in the room that were disturbed.
We've got actual projectiles and bullet holes to be measured in the bed frame and the walls.
As CSI continue processing the crime scene, homicide detectives prepare to speak with Quest Jones at Waco Police Headquarters.
We had him go up into one of our interview rooms. We collected his clothing for forensic analysis. They also took some swabs of his hands.
When Detective Trojanowski sits down with him, Quest is eager to provide more information.
Quest said while he was sitting there in the police station, he was racking his brain, trying to figure out who would do this to him and his family.
And Quest says someone did come to mind.
Remember, she was telling me the other day about some dude coming around.
He said they call him the Ketchup Man.
Police in Waco, Texas are investigating the shooting of 26-year-old mother Sherelle Carter after she was gunned down by an intruder in her own home.
The thing that really stood out to me was just the sheer violence of this, the manner in which Sherelle was killed, the fact that her 3 children were in the room next to where she was murdered when it happened.
Now, detectives are following up with Sherelle's common-law husband, Quest Jones, who says he thinks he's figured out who killed her.
Remember, she was telling me the other day about some dude coming around asking for some flour and ketchup.
Quest tells the police that he and his wife have had several run-ins with this individual, and they call him the Ketchup Man.
He said the man had showed up to his house several times, asking for things like ketchup, sugar, and flour.
Quest even stated that the Ketchup Man had came to the home when he wasn't there, and Sherelle had felt very uncomfortable with his presence.
And she was like, nah, and she just shut the door.
Furthermore, Quest says the Ketchup Man had showed up at their home the afternoon before Sherelle's murder.
I was dozing off going to sleep. Get a knock at the door. Okay. And this dark dude, I stayed at the door watching him walking because he just kept looking back.
When Quest looked out the door, he noticed the Ketchup Man was walking away from the home, but he kept turning, looking over his shoulder.
Quest just said it's something about his eyes that made me think that this is the same man that returned back and killed his wife.
Quest says that now, in retrospect, he has to wonder if the man could have been casing his house when he came by earlier that afternoon.
Quest thought that maybe the Ketchup Man knew that the family was not at home, so it was a perfect opportunity for him to break in the house.
Police keep Quest in holding as they begin research on the mysterious Ketchup Man. But their research doesn't turn up much.
They cannot find anyone who looks like this man or anyone who says that they have seen this man.
But while they may have hit one dead end, a new door opens when an unexpected guest arrives at the station.
Sherelle's friend that she'd gone out with earlier that night had arrived to speak with detectives.
She came up to the police department and wanted to provide us information.
Well, I am sorry for your loss. And working diligently on this. When y'all were driving up there, was there any talk about Quest or anything going on? We were listening to music. Okay.
At first, her statement aligns with what detectives have already learned from Quest Jones.
She and Sherelle went to the club in Mahia around 10:15 p.m., while Quest went and did his own thing.
What about at the club? Were there any problems or? She was happy. She was real happy.
But when pressed about anything out of the ordinary that night, Sherelle's friend admits one thing does stand out.
During the car ride home, Sherelle was talking about how she needed to get rid of some stuff on her phone.
She said something about deleting her messages. Okay. So she won't get caught up.
Sherelle was texting somebody on her phone that night and needed to delete the messages before she got home.
She had started having a relationship with another individual.
In the aftermath of Sherelle Carter's murder, her common-law husband, Quest Jones, has pointed the finger at a suspicious neighborhood drifter he calls the Ketchup Man.
Mr. Jones told the police he didn't know him, but he just thought it was strange that he would come by and ask for random things.
But so far, police haven't been able to track that individual down.
No one had even seen the ketchup man besides Quest.
However, in speaking with Sherelle's friend, investigators have just learned an important new piece of information.
Police found out that Sherelle was texting a man that was not Quest the night of the murder.
Now, is Quest the kind of person that if he saw that, she's texting with another guy, that he's going to be upset about that?
I honestly don't know.
According to her friend, Sherelle had recently admitted she was no longer happy in the relationship with Quest.
After I think they were together for about 10 or 11 years, she just got tired of it and was ready to move on.
I learned in that interview that essentially Sherelle had this long-term relationship with Quest, but that things were over between them and that they weren't legally married. She was trying to move on with her life.
Before we even got in the club, she was like, he didn't want me to go out, so she was like, I don't care, because I'm single.
Okay. That she could do what she wants and he's not in control of her. That was kind of the gist of what she was relaying to you.
The new man Sherelle had been talking to was a former co-worker of hers.
I don't know that I would describe it as an affair so much as just her, she was moving on to a different phase of her life.
For detectives, this was definitely vital information.
Detectives waste no time in tracking down Sherelle's former co-worker, and he's eager to assist in their investigation.
And we became really close.
It started off as friendly co-workers, then they started getting a little flirty, and then eventually they exchanged phone numbers.
They had started going to lunch, then they started texting and talking on the phone.
He said that, yes, they did become incredibly close really fast, and that they did occasionally have sex together.
However, he goes on to say that lately, flirty texting was the extent of their relationship.
We haven't been spending as much time together.
He tells detectives that they remain cool, but they had not been intimate in at least 6 months.
And why is that? Because of Quest.
He stated that Quest had become aggressive and abusive with Sherelle.
Quest was suspicious that Sherelle was having an affair. He went so far as to put recording devices in the home.
And when Quest caught Sherelle lying about her whereabouts, the situation took a turn for the worse.
At that point, Quest viciously beat Sherelle.
This was not a happy relationship. This was an up and down, tumultuous, argumentative, toxic, violent relationship.
Unfortunately, Sherelle refused to press charges.
Quest had been violent with Sherelle for years, but she didn't want to go to the police. She didn't want to get him in any trouble or take him away from the kids.
But before detectives can circle back around to Quest, they need to clear Sherelle's former co-worker.
I'm a big proponent of follow the evidence. Was he anywhere near there? Is there any information that he was involved in this?
He claims that on the night of the murder, he was miles away from Sherelle's house.
In reviewing his phone records, it's clear he's telling the truth.
He was not anywhere near Sherelle's house around the time Sherelle was killed.
Which can only mean one thing.
Investigators need to have another conversation with Quest Jones.
We had multiple instances in the history of this relationship that told us this is escalating toward a violent end.
Police in Waco, Texas have just discovered that Sherelle Carter was hiding secrets from her estranged partner, Quest Jones, including an intimate relationship with a former coworker. But after confirming her coworker's alibi, they're able to clear him of Sherelle's murder.
The information did not point at all to the new love interest.
The same can't be said for Quest Jones. especially after learning their 10-year relationship was riddled with abuse.
Clearly, there was a pattern of violence. There was a pattern of domestic issues, but it hadn't been reported to us to intervene.
However, when Waco detectives do a deeper dive on Quest, they realize he does have a history of domestic violence arrest from his time living in Mexia.
I went into our police records to look at Mr. Jones and his history. You know, was this a couple that we had previous calls on? Was this a couple that there were domestic violence reports on? And there was a history of family violence, which took place in another jurisdiction outside of Waco for the most part.
But one thing was clear. Sherelle was ready to start fresh in Waco and leave Quest for good.
It was very clear to me in talking to her friends, co-workers, and family that Sherelle was moving on in her life.
I think she probably didn't leave soon because of the kids. But my understanding that he supposed to been out that Saturday.
She had given him the ultimatum that he had to be out. That matters in this case. We know that in a domestic violence situation, the most dangerous time in those relationships is when it's ending. And that's exactly when this murder occurred.
Based on everything they've learned, investigators know they need to continue questioning Quest Jones.
He's still in holding at the police station, so they circle back around with him.
When detectives began questioning Quest again, they asked him point blank, why did he lie about the marriage?
You said here recently that your relationship has been pretty good. There haven't been problems or anything else.
He indicated that they had a good relationship, and that they had 3 children together, and that they had only had one recent argument about the dishes not being done, but otherwise everything was fine between them.
Did you know that she was seeing somebody else?
No. Well, I heard about it.
He says, there may have been something going on, but he didn't know who it was.
But how did that make you feel? You guys been together for 10 years, you got 3 kids together, and she's out there going out.
Detective Trojanowski also confronts Quest about why the volume of the TVs were so loud when police arrived on the crime scene.
Why did you turn all the TVs up? They were on full volume.
No, my daughter always does it.
Quest proceeds to tell detectives that that is the normal volume that the family watches the TV shows on.
It's an excuse that's hard to believe.
The 911 call comes in at, I think it was 3:37 in the morning. So that's not a normal time of day for the televisions to be that loud.
Like, they are so loud that the police can't talk to each other. They're in the house. There's no way anybody's hearing it.
Quest appears to be having a hard time keeping up with his own story while he's sitting there. No matter how hard detectives confront him, Quest refuses to admit that he's lying.
You can tell he's getting irritated that he's not being believed.
So irritated, in fact, that something happens detectives never could have anticipated.
When did you exactly lose control of your bowels?
It becomes clear Quest has soiled himself.
You yourself at some point tonight. I did. I could smell you from here, Quest.
I never.
He can't even tell the truth about that.
Regardless, investigators believe they have what they need to charge Quest with first-degree murder.
At that point, I informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Sherelle Carter.
All right. So think about what happened. Think about the road ahead. All right. I know it's difficult. Think about what you need to do for your kids. And maybe it may, for your kids, the best thing may be not the best thing for you.
Detectives transport Quest to the McLennan County Jail. But once he's behind bars, he makes a chilling phone call.
He's harassing and threatening another woman.
And just be looking and get your ass and stated.
In February 2019, Waco police have charged Quest Jones with the murder of his common-law wife, Sherelle Carter. And once he's behind bars, police realize Sherelle wasn't the only woman in Quest's life.
Hello. Hello.
Through jail phone calls, investigators learned Quest had been seeing another woman at the same time he was in a relationship with Sherelle. But now that he's incarcerated for Sherelle's murder, she no longer wants to be with him.
Why you couldn't wait?
Because I'm not going to leave my life and have my life at home for you.
Quest is very upset that his girlfriend isn't staying loyal to him. Now, he starts threatening her.
And just be looking and get your ass and stated. Something told me I should have did it, but...
Quest also implies that when he gets out, he's going to come for her.
Man, don't worry, I'll catch up with you 30 years from now.
Meanwhile, as the trial approaches, evidence against Quest is continuing to pile up.
Lab tests come back showing that Quest had gunpowder residue on his hands and clothing.
This shows that Quest did in fact shoot a gun that night.
However, despite extensive efforts, investigators are unable to recover a gun.
Even after searching and turning the house upside down, they cannot find the murder weapon.
But when police get their hands on Quest's cell phone records, they realize why.
As we referenced in the call detail records with Quest's cell phone, in that window between the time that Sherelle gets home and that 911 call is made, he travels down the road and back.
The cell phone records showed that he had traveled out to what I would best describe as a wooded field.
He travels about a quarter mile to half a mile away to this very wooded area right around when we knew the murder had been committed, then comes back to the house.
He must have drove there, disposed of the gun, and then when he returned home, that's when he started acting hysterical.
Police searched the field extensively with no luck.
We never did recover that weapon.
Based on all of the evidence, prosecutors feel like they have a slam dunk case against Quest. In the fall of 2022, his trial begins in front of a packed courtroom.
The courtroom was full. Both sides were represented by a number of family members, friends.
He didn't show no kind of remorse or nothing. He up there smiling and laughing with his mama and stuff, and I'm like, is something really wrong with him?
The prosecution describes a much darker side of Quest Jones, a jealous, violent man who would rather see the mother of his children dead than thriving on her own.
It's just like a ticking time bomb. Everything just pointed to this is gonna happen at some point, but when?
We presented it as Sherelle being a working mom who is trying to make the best for her family, who is trying to get out of a bad relationship, trying to get away.
And on the night of February 2nd, Sherelle left for a night out with her friends, sending Quest into a downward spiral.
While Sherelle was at the nightclub the night that she was killed, Quest called her phone just continuously, and she didn't answer the phone.
Quest was apparently upset that she had gone to the club with her friends. He sat and stewed in rage and jealousy as he waited for her to return later.
Prosecutors theorize that by the time Sherelle arrived home, Quest's anger had reached a boiling point.
They assumed that he probably confronted her about being with some other man and being out, and she reminded him that we're not together anymore.
Whatever Sherelle said, it pushed Quest past his breaking point. However, the prosecution argues this wasn't a crime of passion. Instead, Quest took the time to plan a diabolical execution.
We believe that Sherelle went inside to go take a shower. We believe that she started the shower, and while she was getting ready to clean up and get ready for the night, he puts the kids in their rooms, he shuts their doors, and that is when he decides that he's going to take Sherelle's life. Quest goes around the house and turns up all of the TVs.
Prosecutors surmise he did that to drown out the sound of the gunshots.
They told me she was asleep when he did it. So that's kind of, eased some of my mind right there.
The gunshots that she suffered and ultimately killed her, as the medical examiner described at trial, would have been lights out immediately.
They surmise once she was dead, he moved her body to the floor to stage the home for the intruder story he'd eventually tell police.
When the jury breaks for deliberations, prosecutors feel cautiously optimistic.
They have to have a unanimous verdict. It either has to be 12 guilty or 12 not guilty.
After a full day of deliberation, the jury announces shocking news.
We find out during those deliberations that they cannot agree. In this case, we had 11 guilty and 1 outlier of not guilty.
At this point, the court had no choice but to declare a mistrial.
That means we have to do this whole thing again.
But as investigators prepare for the second trial, they hit pay dirt.
During preparation for the second trial, we had another witness come forward. He said he had worked with Quest previously and that he knew Quest and Sherelle were on the rocks.
About how he was going through stuff with her. And he used to say little fly stuff like, I murdered that, beat that on or something, stuff like that.
This witness said that Quest asked him to come over to his home one day and that he wants Sherelle dead. He then asks if he would kill Sherelle.
He was like, man, I'm trying to see if you would do it. That's what I do remember. Okay. And I was like, man, bro, you tripping.
The witness tells us that he told Quest, no, I'm not gonna do that for you. That's wrong. You need to go make it right with Sherelle.
When he couldn't get anybody else to do it, he finally decided that he was going to do that himself.
On April 27, 2024, a second jury agrees. This time they find Quest guilty of first-degree murder.
Quest was sentenced to 60 years and has to serve 30 before even being considered for parole.
He hung his head in sort of a knowing way, and that was about the only reaction he had the entire time.
He can sit and think about it, let it eat him up in there, what he did. 60 years, that is like life. It's sort of like life.
I think the biggest thing that can be learned from this case is for family members, relatives, friends, to look out for each other. When they have a feeling in their stomach that there's a red flag or that there's something not right, to see it out, to make sure that your loved one is safe.
Don't ignore the red flags. And as mothers and as fathers, we need to start asking questions. I wish I would have asked, more questions. Just not sweeping it under the rug.
Domestic violence is something that is often silenced, and
the secret survived for 30 years, but the evidence never forgot. On a quiet spring evening in Fort Wayne, Indiana, an 8-year-old girl named April Tinsley disappeared, and what followed would become one of the most haunting unsolved murder investigations in the region. For decades, investigators would search for a name. They would follow leads, examine evidence, question people, and return again and again to the same terrible question: who had taken April and who had killed her? The answer would remain hidden through an entire generation, but somewhere inside the evidence, a biological trace had survived. It was invisible to the public. It was meaningless without the right technology, and it would eventually become the key that shattered the mystery. April was 8 years old in 1988. She should have been thinking about school, friends, summer, family, and the ordinary experiences of childhood. Instead, her life became permanently connected to a case that would remain open for 3 decades. On April 1st, 1988, April disappeared from the Fort Wayne area. The disappearance immediately triggered an investigation. Her family wanted answers. Police wanted to know where she had gone. The community wanted to believe she would be found alive. But the hours passed, and the search became increasingly desperate. Then came the discovery that changed everything. April was found dead, and investigators were confronted with a crime that would remain unsolved for years. The case became more than a missing child investigation. It became a murder investigation with an unknown offender, an unknown motive, and a community desperate to understand what had happened. Investigators began working through the available evidence. They looked for witnesses. They examined the circumstances surrounding April's disappearance. They searched for anyone who might have seen her or noticed something unusual. Every possible lead mattered because the person responsible was still out there. And there was another problem. The investigation did not have the technological tools that detectives would eventually use decades later. Forensic science was developing, but DNA investigation was still far from the sophisticated system that would emerge in the 21st century. Biological evidence could be important, but identifying an unknown person through that evidence was much more difficult. Investigators could preserve a sample. They could develop information from it. But if there was no matching individual in a law enforcement database, the evidence could stop short of producing a name. That limitation would become one of the defining characteristics of April's case. Investigators had clues, but the clues did not immediately lead to a person. The case moved forward, but answers did not. April's family was left with the unbearable reality that their child was gone and the person responsible remained unidentified. In the months and years that followed, the investigation became a cold case, but the word cold could never describe what the family felt. To investigators, a cold case meant that active leads had diminished. To the people who loved April, there was nothing cold about it. The loss remained. The questions remained. The absence remained. April did not grow old. She remained 8 years old in photographs while everyone around her continued through the years. That contrast would become one of the most painful elements of the story. The calendar moved forward, but April's story did not. Then something unexpected happened years later. The case began generating disturbing communication. Investigators received messages that appeared to come from someone claiming knowledge of April's murder. The communications were not simply random statements. They appeared designed to shock, frighten, and provoke authorities. Biological material was associated with some of the communications, creating another potential source of evidence. But investigators still faced the same fundamental problem. Who was behind them? Was the person actually connected to April's murder? Was someone exploiting a notorious unsolved case? Could the biological material provide a reliable connection? At the time, those questions remained unanswered. The messages became another layer of mystery surrounding an already disturbing investigation. Years passed again. The case remained open, but the identity of April's killer stayed hidden. Then forensic science entered a new era. The world began to change rapidly. DNA technology improved. Genetic databases expanded. Genealogy became increasingly popular. People began submitting DNA to commercial databases to learn about ancestry and distant relatives. What began as a way for ordinary people to explore their family histories would eventually create an entirely new possibility for criminal investigators. If an unknown offender's DNA could not be matched directly to him, perhaps it could be connected to someone related to him. That idea changed cold case investigations forever. Investigative genetic genealogy could take an unidentified DNA profile and search for relatives, sometimes very distant ones. The goal was not to immediately identify the offender. The goal was to construct a path toward him. A relative could lead to a family. A family could lead to a branch. A branch could lead to a smaller group of potential suspects. And eventually, investigators could compare those possibilities against traditional evidence. It was a revolutionary concept, and April's case became one of the investigations where that concept would prove extraordinarily powerful. The work was complex. Investigators and genealogists had to examine genetic relationships and build family trees. They had to determine which relatives were relevant and which were not. They had to account for generations of family connections. The process required patience because a genetic connection alone could never establish guilt. It could only provide direction, but direction was exactly what the investigation had been missing for 30 years. Eventually, the genetic trail began pointing toward the Miller family. One name emerged as investigators narrowed the possibilities: John D. Miller. Suddenly, the case that had spent decades surrounded by unknowns had a potential suspect. But detectives did not immediately rush to the conclusion that Miller was the killer. They needed confirmation. They needed evidence that could withstand scrutiny. They needed to know whether the DNA associated with Miller was the same DNA connected to April's murder. The answer would come through direct forensic tests. Investigators obtained biological material associated with Miller and compared it with the evidence preserved from the case. The result was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The DNA connected Miller to the forensic evidence. The anonymous biological profile had a name. The unknown offender had become a specific person. But even then, the investigation was not finished. Detectives still needed to understand what Miller knew. They needed to know whether he would speak. They needed to determine whether his statements would correspond with the evidence. In July 2018, investigators approached Miller. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. His response was startling. He said, "April Tinsley." The name had been hidden behind an unknown offender for 30 years, yet Miller immediately identified the subject of the investigation. Detectives confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and transported her body to the place where she was found. The case had suddenly moved from uncertainty to revelation. The man investigators had reached through genetic genealogy was now allegedly describing the crime. The biological evidence had identified him. His statements added another layer to the case. The investigation that had once seemed trapped in the past had finally broken free. But the breakthrough also raised an unsettling question. How could someone remain unidentified for 30 years when evidence had existed from the beginning? The answer was not that the evidence had failed. The evidence had simply been waiting for science to catch up. In 1988, investigators could not use the methods available in 2018. There was no practical way to construct the same kind of genetic family tree from the evidence. The technology had not yet arrived. 30 years later, it had. And that meant the killer's greatest advantage had been time. Time had allowed the investigation to grow cold. Time had allowed memories to fade. Time had allowed the public's attention to move elsewhere. But time had also allowed forensic science to evolve. The very years that appeared to protect the killer eventually created the tools that could expose him. That contradiction would become central to the legacy of April's case. The killer had survived the investigation of one era. He could not survive the technology of another. By July 2018, John D. Miller was under arrest. For April's family, the news was almost impossible to absorb. 30 years earlier, they had lost a child. Now they were finally learning who had been responsible. The arrest did not erase the grief. It did not return April. It did not undo the years of uncertainty. But it changed one thing that had haunted the family since 1988. They finally knew. The name that had been missing for 3 decades was no longer missing. The evidence had spoken, and the secret that had survived for 30 years had finally begun to collapse. The name John D. Miller changed everything, but an arrest was not the same as an explanation, and for investigators who had spent decades staring at an unanswered case file, The sudden appearance of a suspect created as many questions as it answered. For 30 years, April Tinsley had been remembered as the little girl whose murder had become one of Fort Wayne's most painful mysteries, and now detectives had a man whose DNA connected him to the evidence. But they still had to reconstruct what happened, establish the strength of every piece of evidence, and understand how a case that had seemed frozen in time could suddenly move with such speed. The investigation had entered a new and dangerous phase. A cold case can survive uncertainty for decades, but once a suspect is identified, every old fact becomes important again. Every report must be examined. Every sample must be documented. Every statement must be tested against the physical evidence. There is no room for a dramatic shortcut. The prosecution has to build a case strong enough to survive the courtroom, not merely convince the public. That was the challenge facing investigators in 2018. They had the genetic genealogy they had the direct DNA connection, they had Miller's statements. But behind each of those discoveries was a much older story, one that began in 1988 when April was only 8 years old. Her disappearance had immediately transformed an ordinary community into a search zone. People looked for her. Investigators worked to reconstruct her movements. Family members waited for news. The hope that she might still be found alive slowly gave way to the devastating discovery that she had been murdered. Once that happened, the investigation changed completely. Detectives were no longer searching simply for a missing child. They were searching for a killer. And the killer had something investigators desperately needed: knowledge. He knew where April had been. He knew what had happened to her. He knew where her body had been left. Investigators had to reconstruct those events without the benefit of his cooperation. They worked from physical evidence, witness information, and whatever traces the offender had left behind. Among those traces was biological evidence. That evidence would eventually become the most important surviving link to the killer. But at the beginning, it could not produce a name. The profile belonged to an unknown male. That phrase would define the investigation for decades. Unknown male, a description without an identity, a biological signature without a face. The case could tell investigators that a particular person was connected to the evidence, but the person's name remained beyond reach. That limitation was devastating because it meant investigators could not simply locate the offender and question him. They could not search his home. They could not compare his movements with April's disappearance. They could not confront him with the evidence. He existed somewhere outside the investigation, protected not necessarily by extraordinary intelligence, but by the limitations of the technology available at the time. Then came the disturbing communication. Years after April's murder, authorities received messages that appeared to contain information about the case. The communications were deeply unsettling because they suggested that someone connected to the crime was still willing to interact with investigators. The possibility created a new psychological dimension. If the offender was behind the messages, then he had not simply disappeared into ordinary life. He was apparently watching. He was apparently willing to remind investigators that the case still existed. Biological material associated with some of the communications eventually became important because investigators could compare it with the original forensic evidence. The result indicated that the same male DNA profile was involved. That connection was significant. It meant the communications could not simply be dismissed as an unrelated attempt to exploit the case. The biological evidence pointed toward the same unknown male. Yet the central mystery remained intact. Who was he? Investigators still did not know. Years continued to pass. Detectives changed. Technology improved. The world entered the digital age. Databases became larger. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Genealogy became increasingly accessible. Millions of people began exploring their ancestry through genetic testing, often searching for distant relatives and family origins. Behind the scenes, forensic scientists began recognizing the investigative possibilities. If the DNA of an unknown offender could be linked to relatives, investigators might be able to work backward through generations and eventually identify the person who had committed the crime. The concept sounded almost impossible when compared with traditional police work. Instead of finding a suspect and testing his DNA, investigators could begin with the DNA and search for a family. Instead of asking who was already in the database, they could ask who might be related to the person represented by the unknown profile. That change in direction was crucial. It meant that an offender did not necessarily have to have a criminal record. He did not necessarily have to have provided DNA to police. He did not even have to have submitted his own DNA to a genealogy database. A relative could provide the connection. That possibility transformed the April Tinsley investigation. Specialists began working with the unidentified DNA profile. Genetic relationships were examined. Family trees were constructed. Names were compared. Branches were followed and eliminated. The work was painstaking because distant genetic relationships can point toward large networks of people. Investigators had to determine which individuals could realistically be connected to the crime. They had to consider age, location, family relationships, and other evidence. Genetic genealogy could point investigators in a direction, but it could not replace traditional detective work. Eventually, the investigation began pointing toward John D. Miller. His name emerged from the genealogical research, giving detectives something they had not possessed in decades: a specific person to investigate. But this was the moment when discipline mattered most. A genetic genealogy lead was not proof of guilt. It was a lead. Detectives needed direct confirmation. They needed to compare Miller's DNA with the evidence connected to April's murder. That confirmation came through forensic testing. Investigators obtained biological material connected to Miller and submitted it for comparison. The result was decisive. The DNA profile matched the biological evidence associated with the case. The unknown male was no longer unknown. The investigation had finally crossed the bridge between evidence and identity. And then came the arrest. In July 2018, Miller was taken into custody. The news moved rapidly through Fort Wayne and far beyond it. After 30 years, the case had produced a suspect. But perhaps the most striking detail came from Miller's interaction with detectives. According to the probable cause affidavit, when investigators asked whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him, Miller responded by naming April. That response immediately drew attention because April's name had remained connected to the investigation for 3 decades. Miller's answer suggested that he understood exactly what the detectives were referring to. Investigators then confronted him with the evidence. According to the affidavit, he eventually admitted his involvement in April's abduction, sexual assault, and murder. He described taking her and later transporting her body to the location where she was discovered. For investigators, the statement was another extraordinary development. They had spent decades trying to reconstruct the crime from evidence. Now the man they believed responsible was providing an account of what happened. Yet detectives could not simply rely on his words. The physical evidence remained critical. The DNA connection had to be documented. The circumstances surrounding his statements had to be established. Every detail had to be preserved for court. The case had become a legal matter now, not simply an investigative mystery. Miller was charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. The investigation had reached the point where the evidence would be tested inside a courtroom. For April's family, the transition was emotionally overwhelming. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. Now they faced the reality that the person suspected of killing April had finally been identified. The arrest could not change what happened in 1988, but it could change what happened next. There would be accountability. There would be a legal record. There would be a name attached to the crime. And there would finally be an answer to the question that had remained open for 30 years. But the investigation still contained one of its most remarkable elements. The evidence that identified Miller had not been created in 2018. It had been waiting since the beginning. The DNA had survived the decades. The case file had survived. The biological traces associated with the communications had survived. What changed was not the evidence. What changed was the ability to understand it. In 1988, the unknown male profile was a dead end. In 2018, it became the beginning of a genetic investigation that led to a family tree, then to a suspect, then to a DNA confirmation, and finally to an arrest. The same biological clue had existed across an entire generation, silently waiting for science to catch up with it. That realization gave the case an almost unsettling quality. The answer had been there all along, hidden in something invisible to the human eye. The killer had not erased every trace. He had simply survived long enough to benefit from the limitations of an earlier era. But time had changed the balance. Technology had advanced. Investigators had learned new methods. Genetic genealogy had created a pathway where none had existed before. And suddenly, the 30-year silence was broken. The case was no longer a mystery without a face. It had a suspect. It had evidence. It had an arrest. And April Tinsley's name, once surrounded by unanswered questions, was now at the center of an investigation moving toward the courtroom. 30 years earlier, the search had begun with hope. It had ended in tragedy. Now, 3 decades later, another search had begun, this time through DNA and family history. And this search had finally found the man investigators had been looking for. The discovery of John D. Miller's identity did not arrive like a single lightning strike. It came through a trail that had been quietly forming for years, hidden inside evidence that investigators had preserved long after the public had stopped hearing daily updates about April Tinsley's murder. By the time genetic genealogy entered the investigation, the case was already more than a crime. It was a piece of Fort Wayne's history, a name remembered by people who had been children when April disappeared and who were adults with families of their own when her killer was finally identified. The passage of time had transformed the investigation, but it had not erased the evidence. The most important question was whether investigators could find a way to make that evidence speak. The DNA profile associated with the case had always carried information. It could distinguish the biological material connected to the crime from the genetic material of other people. It could establish that the same unknown male was connected to different pieces of evidence. But a DNA profile without a database match was like a locked door with no key. Investigators could stand in front of it for years without knowing how to open it. Conventional forensic databases were designed around known individuals. If an offender had been arrested and his DNA collected, a future crime could potentially produce a match. But what if the offender had never been arrested? What if he had never entered the system? What if he had lived an ordinary life for decades without giving investigators a reason to collect his DNA? That was the problem facing the April Tinsley investigation. The unknown profile had nowhere obvious to go. The killer could remain outside the traditional system indefinitely. Genetic genealogy changed the question. Instead of asking whether the unknown offender was already known, investigators could ask whether anyone genetically related to him had appeared in a database. The answer did not have to be a close relative. A distant family connection could be enough to create the first thread. From there, investigators could work through genealogical records and reconstruct a family network. That process was slow and highly specialized. A single genetic connection could point toward numerous relatives. Researchers had to determine which relationships were biologically plausible. They had to build family trees that could span generations. They had to identify living descendants and determine which branches of a family could contain the unknown offender. Traditional police work remained essential. Investigators had to compare those possibilities with the facts of the crime. Age mattered. Geography mattered. Timing mattered. Family relationships mattered. The genealogy could narrow the field, but it could not tell investigators which person was guilty. Eventually, however, the trail began narrowing toward John D. Miller. For investigators, this was the moment when a case that had been defined by an unknown profile suddenly had a human face. But the name itself was only the beginning. Detectives had to verify everything. A 30-year-old murder could not be solved on intuition. The evidence had to withstand scrutiny. They needed to establish a direct DNA connection between Miller and the biological material preserved from April's case. The method was straightforward in principle, but critical in practice. Investigators obtained discarded biological material associated with Miller and submitted it for forensic testing. The result confirmed the genetic connection. The DNA from Miller matched the profile that had been associated with the investigation for decades. The significance was enormous. The unknown male was now identified. The biological evidence that had remained anonymous since 1988 now belonged to a specific individual. The investigation had crossed its most difficult barrier, but there was another piece of the puzzle that made the case especially disturbing. Years after April's murder, investigators received communications apparently connected to someone claiming knowledge of the crime. The messages became part of the long shadow surrounding the case. They were not merely words. Biological material was associated with some of them, and forensic analysis connected that material to the same unknown male DNA profile. That meant the investigation contained evidence that potentially reached beyond the original crime scene. Whoever was responsible had apparently left another biological trace while communicating with authorities. At the time, detectives could not turn that trace into a name, but they preserved it. And decades later, it became another part of the forensic picture. The irony was profound. If those communications were intended to intimidate investigators, they ultimately created another piece of evidence. If they were intended to keep the case alive, they did something else as well. They gave investigators additional biological material to work with. The unknown offender had apparently believed that he controlled the mystery because he knew the truth, and the police did not. But the biological evidence created a different balance. DNA could carry information without the offender's permission. It could survive after memories faded. It could remain useful even when detectives changed. It did not depend on a witness remembering a face correctly decades later. It did not depend on someone voluntarily telling investigators what they knew. It simply remained. The discovery of Miller's identity therefore represented more than a successful genealogy investigation. It represented the moment when an old piece of evidence finally acquired meaning. Investigators could now connect the DNA profile with a person, and they could compare that person with the rest of the investigation. The result was not merely a theory, it was a case that could move forward. In July 2018, Miller was arrested. The arrest sent shock waves through Fort Wayne. For 30 years, April's murder had been one of those cases people remembered precisely because it had no ending. Now there was an ending in sight. The unknown suspect had a name. The DNA evidence pointed toward him, and investigators were ready to ask him questions. According to the probable cause affidavit, when detectives asked Miller if he knew why they wanted to speak with him, he responded by identifying April. That detail became one of the most chilling moments of the investigation. The name of an 8-year-old girl had remained inside police files for 3 decades, yet the man investigators had identified immediately understood the subject of the conversation. The detectives then presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually confessed to abducting April, sexually assaulting her, killing her, and transporting her body to the location where she was found. The statements gave investigators an account of the crime from the person they believed responsible. But the DNA remained central because it had led them there. The confession did not create the case from nothing. It came after the forensic investigation had already established a connection. That sequence mattered. It showed that the investigation was not built solely around a statement. It was built around physical evidence, genealogical research, direct DNA testing, and statements that investigators could evaluate against the rest of the evidence. The case had become increasingly difficult for Miller to escape. The genetic evidence pointed toward him. The direct DNA comparison confirmed the connection. His statements provided additional information. The investigation had traveled from an unidentified biological profile to a living suspect and then to an alleged admission. For April's family, the developments must have carried a strange mixture of relief and pain. For 30 years, they had wanted to know who had taken April from them. Now they were learning the answer. But knowing the identity of a killer is not the same as recovering the person who was lost. April remained gone. Her childhood remained frozen in 1988. The years between her death and the arrest could not be returned. The breakthrough could only provide truth and accountability. That distinction would remain important throughout the legal process. The public often imagines a solved case as a moment of celebration. But for victims' families, solving a murder can be profoundly complicated. The uncertainty ends, but the reality becomes sharper. For years, the family could imagine possibilities. Once a suspect is identified and evidence is presented, those possibilities disappear. The truth becomes permanent. In April's case, that truth was devastating. Yet it was also necessary. Without it, the family would have continued living with an unanswered question that had already lasted a generation. Miller's arrest also demonstrated the changing nature of cold case investigations. A detective working in 1988 could not have followed the same path as investigators working in 2018. The scientific tools were different. The databases were different. The investigative possibilities were different, but the commitment to the evidence remained the same. That continuity connected to generations of investigators, the people who collected evidence decades earlier, could not have known exactly how it would eventually be used. They simply had to preserve it carefully. That decision proved crucial. The biological material remained available long enough for modern science to analyze it in ways earlier investigators could not have imagined. This is one of the most powerful lessons of cold case work. Evidence does not always become less valuable with age. Sometimes it becomes more valuable because science improves around it. A sample that once produced only a partial answer may later become decisive. A profile that once had no match may eventually be linked to a distant relative. A case that once seemed impossible may suddenly become solvable because someone develops a new method of asking the evidence what it knows. April's murder became a powerful demonstration of that principle. The case had survived because the evidence survived. The killer had remained unidentified because the technology had not yet caught up. But eventually, the technology did, and when it did, investigators followed the genetic trail until it led to John D. Miller. The mystery that had dominated the case for 30 years had finally acquired a name. But the investigation still had one final arena to enter. The courtroom would determine what that evidence meant under the law. The genealogy would have to be explained. The DNA would have to be established. The statements would have to be examined, and Miller would have to answer for the charges against him. After 30 years of silence, the case was no longer waiting for a clue. It was waiting for judgment. The arrest transformed April Tinsley's murder from a decades-old mystery into an active criminal case. But the moment the handcuffs closed around John D. Miller's wrists, another clock began ticking. Investigators had spent years trying to discover who was responsible. Now prosecutors had to prove what the evidence meant. The difference was enormous. Finding a suspect could happen through a breakthrough. Convicting that suspect required a chain of evidence strong enough to survive every challenge inside a courtroom. And in April's case, that chain stretched back 30 years. Every year mattered. Every piece of evidence had a history. Every statement had to be documented. Every forensic conclusion had to be defensible. The case could not simply depend on the dramatic revelation that genetic genealogy had identified a man. It had to demonstrate that the man identified through that process was the same person whose biological material had been connected to April's murder. That was why the direct DNA comparison was so important. Genetic genealogy had provided investigators with a direction, but traditional forensic testing provided confirmation. Miller's DNA was compared with the evidence associated with the investigation, and the result connected him to the profile investigators had carried for decades. The unknown male had finally become a known individual. That connection dramatically changed the case. For years, the investigation had revolved around an anonymous biological profile. Now, detectives could place that profile beside a name, an address, a history, and a living person. They could investigate Miller as an individual. They could examine his statements. They could compare his account with what was already known. The investigation had moved from searching the darkness to testing a specific theory, but there was something else that made the case particularly disturbing. April's killer had apparently remained connected to the investigation even after the original murder. Communications had been sent to authorities years later, apparently by someone claiming knowledge of the crime. Those communications had been disturbing enough on their own, but they became far more significant when biological material associated with them was linked to the same unknown male profile connected to the murder. The killer had apparently left another trace. The messages may have been designed to frighten or manipulate investigators, but DNA turned the situation around. Words could be denied. Biological evidence was different. It could be tested. It could be compared. It could be connected. The same unknown male profile appearing in multiple pieces of evidence strengthened the conclusion that investigators were dealing with one offender. For years, however, that profile had remained anonymous. Then, genetic genealogy changed the investigation. The process began by using the unidentified DNA to search for relatives. Instead of looking for a direct match, investigators looked for genetic relationships. That was the revolutionary step. A relative could lead to a family could lead to a branch could lead to a specific individual, but each stage required careful verification. Investigators could not simply see a possible family connection and declare the case solved. They had to reconstruct relationships and eliminate people who did not fit the evidence. They had to examine the historical record. They had to consider where potential suspects lived and whether their circumstances made sense in relation to the crime. The investigation gradually narrowed. Eventually, John D. Miller emerged as the person investigators needed to examine more closely. At that moment, the case entered a delicate stage. A mistake could destroy years of work. A false accusation could create another tragedy. Detectives therefore needed direct forensic confirmation. They obtained biological material connected to Miller and compared it with the DNA associated with the case. The result provided the confirmation they needed. The man identified through genealogical research was connected directly to the biological evidence. That discovery made the arrest possible. In July 2018, Miller was taken into custody. The news was extraordinary because April's murder had remained unresolved for 3 decades. People who had grown accustomed to hearing the phrase cold case suddenly heard something different. A suspect had been identified. An arrest had been made. The investigation was moving again. For April's family, the announcement must have carried an almost impossible mixture of emotions. There was the relief of finally knowing that someone had been identified. There was the shock of hearing the name after 30 years. There was the pain of confronting details that had remained unknown. And there was the knowledge that no legal development could restore April's life. The arrest could provide accountability. It could not provide a second chance. Investigators then had the opportunity to speak directly with Miller. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked him whether he knew why they wanted to talk to him. His response was immediate. He identified April. That moment became one of the most striking details of the investigation. The name of an 8-year-old girl had been at the center of the case for 30 years, yet the suspect apparently understood exactly what detectives meant. Investigators then presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and transported her body to the location where she was found. His account gave detectives another piece of the puzzle. They had physical evidence. They had genealogical evidence. They had direct DNA evidence. Now they had statements from the man they believed responsible. The investigation had become remarkably comprehensive. But even then, the legal system had to proceed carefully. Miller faced serious charges, including murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. He initially pleaded not guilty. The possibility of a trial meant that investigators and prosecutors would have to prepare every element of the case. A 30-year-old crime creates special challenges. Witnesses may have moved away or died. Memories may have changed. Documents may be difficult to locate. Physical evidence must be carefully documented to demonstrate that it was preserved correctly. Experts may have to explain scientific methods to a jury. Prosecutors must show not only that the DNA belongs to the defendant, but that the evidence was collected and handled properly. In April's case, however, the DNA evidence had an advantage that many other pieces of evidence did not. Biological material does not rely on memory. A witness might forget a face after 30 years. A DNA profile does not suddenly forget its genetic structure. A family tree can be reconstructed. A biological match can be tested. The science provides a form of continuity across time. That continuity became the backbone of the case. The investigation also highlighted an important distinction between genetic genealogy and conventional DNA analysis. Genetic genealogy was the tool that helped investigators find the suspect. Direct DNA testing was the tool that confirmed the suspect. Those were separate steps. The first created the lead. The second established the forensic connection. Traditional detective work then connected the scientific evidence to the rest of the investigation. The entire process demonstrated that modern cold case solving is rarely about one magical technology. It is about combining methods. A genealogy researcher can identify a possible family. A detective can investigate that family. A laboratory can compare DNA. A prosecutor can present the results in court. Each discipline contributes something different. April's case became a powerful example of what can happen when those pieces work together. Yet there was another reality that could not be ignored. For 3 decades, April's killer had remained outside the reach of the law. He had lived through years in which the case received less public attention. He had watched technology change. He had watched the world move forward. He may have believed that the passage of time had permanently separated him from the crime. But the evidence had never made that agreement. It remained connected to him whether he knew it or not. The DNA profile was a silent record. The communications created another biological connection. The genealogy investigation created a family pathway. The direct comparison closed the gap. By the summer of 2018, the distance between April's murder and the person responsible had collapsed. The case had traveled from an unknown offender to a named suspect in a matter of months after decades of stagnation. That contrast was almost surreal. 30 years of silence, then suddenly, movement everywhere. Detectives, laboratory, genealogists, prosecutors, court documents, arrest warrants, interviewed. The machinery of justice was moving again. For April's family, however, the speed could not erase the years. They had waited through birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and ordinary days that would never include April again. They had lived with a question that had no answer. Now the answer was coming, but it was an answer no family should ever have to receive. That is the painful paradox of solving a murder. The truth is necessary, but the truth is often terrible. Still, there was meaning in finally knowing. The identity of the offender was no longer speculation. The evidence had given investigators a name. The investigation had given the family an explanation. The legal system would now decide the consequences, and the case was about to enter its final stage. Miller's eventual guilty plea would remove the need for a full trial and bring the decades-long investigation toward its formal conclusion. But before that happened, the story of the evidence had already changed the way investigators understood cold cases. The past was no longer necessarily sealed. Old DNA could become new evidence. Old files could become new leads, and a case that had seemed impossible could suddenly become solvable when the right technology arrived. April's murder had waited through an entire generation. The evidence had waited too, and now both had reached the courtroom. By the time John D. Miller stood at the center of the investigation, April Tinsley's murder had already passed through several generations of detectives, technologies, and unanswered questions. What made the case extraordinary was not simply that investigators had finally identified a suspect. It was the way the identity had emerged from evidence that had been silent for decades. The biological profile had existed long before Miller's name appeared in the investigation. The evidence had been collected when April was alive only in memory, and when the word cold case did not yet carry the same meaning, it would decades later. Now everything was converging. The arrest had happened. The DNA connection had been established. Miller had spoken to investigators. The case was moving toward court. But the deeper investigators looked, the more remarkable the path became. The question was no longer only who killed April, it was how the truth had managed to remain hidden for so long. The answer was embedded in the limitations of the era. In 1988, investigators did not have the modern ability to search enormous genetic networks for distant relatives. DNA could provide powerful evidence, but without a matching profile, it could leave investigators staring at an anonymous biological signature. That was exactly what happened. The unknown male profile remained in the case, but there was no direct identification. Detectives could compare evidence from different sources and determine whether it belonged to the same person, but they could not attach a name. The profile was powerful and frustrating at the same time. It told investigators that the offender had left something behind. It simply refused to tell them who he was. Then the years began accumulating. April's murder became a cold case. The phrase appeared in news reports and investigative records. People who had once followed every development began hearing less about it. New crimes demanded attention. New investigations took priority. Detectives moved to other assignments. Some retired. Others transferred. The case file remained, waiting. Yet the evidence remained too. That distinction is crucial. A cold case is not necessarily an empty case. It can be a case filled with information that has not yet produced an answer. April's investigation contained biological evidence. It contained investigative records. It contained memories and reports. And eventually, it contained communications that would create another strange connection between the unknown offender and the investigation. Those communications were deeply disturbing because they appeared to come from someone who knew details surrounding April's murder. Biological material associated with some of them could be tested. The testing connected the material to the same male DNA profile associated with the case. That meant the mystery was not disappearing. It was leaving additional traces. The person behind the communications, if he was indeed the offender, had apparently created evidence that investigators could preserve and examine later. The irony was brutal. Someone attempting to remind authorities of an unsolved murder may have been creating the very evidence that would eventually help solve it. But even with the additional biological material, investigators still faced the same obstacle. They knew the DNA profile. They did not know the person. That problem remained until genetic genealogy changed the landscape. Investigators could now use the unknown DNA to search for relatives. The process was not a simple database search. It was closer to reconstructing a family tree from genetic fragments. A genetic relationship might indicate a distant cousin or another relative. That person could be connected to a larger family network. Investigators could then trace the network backward and forward, examining generations and narrowing possible branches. It required expertise, patience, and traditional investigative work. Eventually, the trail pointed toward the Miller family. John D. Miller became a potential suspect, but investigators understood that the genealogy alone was not enough. They needed direct evidence. They needed to know whether Miller's DNA matched the unknown profile. So detectives obtained biological material associated with him. The sample was tested. The result confirmed the connection. The profile that had remained unidentified since April's murder belonged to Miller. That single discovery transformed the investigation. For the first time, detectives had a direct link between a living person and the biological evidence. The cold case had a suspect. The suspect had a DNA connection. The investigation now had momentum. In July 2018, Miller was arrested. The news was shocking because the case had been unresolved for 30 years. The public had watched the years pass. Some people who remembered April's disappearance had grown old. Others had been born long after the crime and knew the case only as a piece of local history. Now the name of the alleged killer was suddenly everywhere. The investigation was no longer about an unknown figure. It was about John D. Miller, and the details of his interaction with detectives made the arrest even more striking. According to the probable cause affidavit, investigators asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. He responded by naming April. That answer immediately became a key moment in the investigation. Detectives then confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and transported her body to the location where she was discovered. The statement was devastating, but it also provided investigators with something they had lacked for decades: an account from the man they believed responsible. The case now contained multiple forms of evidence pointing in the same direction. The genetic genealogy had identified Miller as a potential suspect. Direct DNA testing connected him to the biological evidence. His statements provided additional information. The communications and associated biological material strengthened the historical connection. The investigation had become a chain rather than a single clue. That mattered because prosecutors were preparing for the possibility of a trial. A case this old would inevitably face challenges. The defense could question the genealogy methodology. Experts might have to explain how the family connection had been established. The handling of the DNA evidence would have to be demonstrated. The circumstances surrounding Miller's statements would have to be examined. The prosecution would need to establish that every important piece of evidence was reliable. But the longer the investigation continued, the clearer the overall picture became. The evidence was not isolated. It was interconnected, and the central biological profile remained consistent. That consistency was one of the strongest elements of the case. The DNA did not change because 30 years had passed. It did not become less specific because memories had faded. It remained a biological identifier. The science had improved, but the underlying evidence remained the same. That was why the case became such an important example of modern cold case investigation. The breakthrough did not come from discovering a new crime scene. It came from reinterpreting old evidence through new technology. The original investigators could not have known what future scientists would be able to do. They simply collected what they could. Years later, that evidence became the foundation of a completely different investigative strategy. Genetic genealogy also changed the concept of what it meant for a suspect to remain outside a database. Miller did not have to be directly listed in a law enforcement DNA system for investigators to reach him. A relative could provide the first connection. That relative might never have suspected that his or her genetic information could become part of a murder investigation. This capability raised major questions about privacy and ethics, but in April's case, it also created something her family had been waiting for since 1988, an identity. The science could not bring April back. It could not undo the crime, but it could answer the question that had remained open for 30 years, and that answer mattered. Families of murder victims often live with uncertainty in a way that outsiders may never fully understand. When a case is unsolved, there is no definitive narrative. There are theories, there are suspicions, there are possibilities, but there is no final answer. The mind can remain trapped in those possibilities for years. A solved case changes that. The truth may be painful, but it is fixed. There is no longer a need to wonder whether the offender will ever be found. There is no longer a question about whether someone else could be responsible. There is a legal conclusion. For April's family, the identification of Miller meant the end of one kind of suffering, even as it opened another. They now knew who had killed April. They knew the name that had been missing from the story for 3 decades. They knew that the person responsible would face the legal system, but they also had to confront the reality of what the evidence revealed. The answer was not comforting. It was final. That is the paradox at the center of every cold case solved after decades. The moment everyone has been waiting for can also be the moment everyone fears. The mystery ends, but the grief becomes concrete. Miller initially pleaded not guilty after being charged. The possibility of a trial remained. Prosecutors prepared to present the evidence. The case could have required testimony from experts and investigators. It could have forced April's story to be told in court in painful detail. But the legal process took a different path. Miller eventually pleaded guilty. On December 7, 2018, he admitted guilt to the charges related to April's murder. The plea eliminated the need for a full trial. It also established responsibility in a formal legal setting. Later that month, he received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence meant that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The courtroom had delivered its judgment. 30 years after April's murder, the legal system finally had a definitive answer. But outside the courtroom, the significance of the case continued to grow. Investigators around the country were watching the power of genetic genealogy. Families with unsolved cases began wondering whether old DNA evidence might finally be useful. Police departments began reviewing evidence from crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. The technology was creating new possibilities, but it also created new responsibilities. Genetic information could expose family relationships. It could identify people who had never been suspected of anything. It could reveal connections that individuals had never intended to make public. The same technology that could provide justice also required careful limits. April's case stood at the center of that debate because it demonstrated what the technology could accomplish at its most powerful. An unknown offender had remained unidentified for 30 years. Then investigators followed a genetic trail and found him. The biological evidence had survived. The science had evolved. The case had finally moved. And the most unsettling part was that the killer's advantage had never been complete. He had escaped identification, but he had never escaped the evidence. The evidence had been waiting in silence, waiting through changing technology, waiting through changing investigators, waiting through decades of public attention, fading and returning. And finally, it had found a voice. That voice was not a witness. It was not a confession at first. It was DNA, and once investigators learned how to listen to it, the secret that had remained buried since 1988 could no longer remain hidden. For 30 years, the murder of April Tinsley existed in the uncomfortable space between evidence and identity, a case where investigators knew that the killer had left something behind but could not determine exactly who had left it. That distinction would become the foundation of one of the most remarkable cold case breakthroughs in Indiana. The biological evidence was not a rumor. It was not a theory. It was a physical connection to the crime, preserved through decades of technological change. What investigators lacked was a way to transform that connection into a person's name. By 2018, the world had changed enough to make that possible. The breakthrough would come through a combination of genetic genealogy, conventional police work, and forensic DNA testing. But the first step was recognizing that an old case might contain a new opportunity. Investigators knew the DNA profile associated with the unknown male. They also knew that conventional database searches had not produced the identity they needed. The obvious path had failed. A different path was required. Genetic genealogy offered that path. Instead of looking for the offender himself, investigators could search for people genetically related to him. The concept was deceptively simple. The execution was anything but. A genetic match does not arrive with a label saying this is the killer. It may point to a distant relative. That relative may share only a small portion of DNA with the unknown offender. Investigators must then reconstruct family relationships across generations, identifying common ancestors and tracing descendants. A family tree can contain hundreds or even thousands of people. The challenge is to determine which branches matter. Every possibility must be tested against the fact. The investigation becomes a mixture of genetics, genealogy, historical research, and traditional detective work. In April's case, that process gradually narrowed the field. The genetic evidence pointed investigators toward the Miller family. Among the people connected to that family was John D. Miller. His name immediately became significant, but investigators knew they could not treat the genealogical connection as proof. They needed direct evidence. They needed Miller's DNA, and they needed a comparison that could establish whether he was the same person represented by the unknown profile. Investigators obtained discarded biological material associated with Miller. The material was analyzed. The result confirmed what the genealogical investigation had suggested. Miller's DNA matched the profile associated with the evidence from April's case. The significance of that moment was enormous. For decades, investigators had possessed a genetic profile, but no identity. Now the identity had been established. The unknown male had become John D. Miller. The cold case had a suspect. But the story contained another extraordinary layer. Investigators had received disturbing communications connected to April's murder years after the crime. Those communications appeared to come from someone who claimed knowledge of the case. Biological material was associated with some of them. When that material was analyzed, it was connected to the same male DNA profile found in the investigation. That meant the biological trail extended beyond the original evidence. The unknown offender had apparently left another trace years after April's death. At the time, investigators could not use that trace to identify him, but they preserved it. And decades later, the material became part of the chain leading toward Miller. It was a strange reversal. If the communications had been intended to frighten investigators, they may have achieved the opposite. They created additional evidence. If they were intended to demonstrate control over the mystery, they ultimately provided another biological link. The offender could control his words, but he could not control the genetic information he left behind. Once Miller became the focus of the investigation, detectives began assembling the case carefully. They could not afford to treat the genealogy breakthrough as a shortcut. Genetic genealogy could produce a lead. Direct DNA testing could confirm the lead. Traditional investigative work had to establish the circumstances. The process was methodical. Investigators examined Miller's connection to the case. They reviewed the evidence. They prepared to confront him. Then, in July 2018, they arrested him. The arrest brought the 30-year investigation into a new phase. The public learned that the person authorities believed responsible had finally been identified. The case that had been described as unsolved for decades suddenly had a living suspect sitting in custody. And then came the interview. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. His response was immediate. He named April. The answer was startling because investigators had not needed to explain the case before he identified it. They then presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted that he had abducted April, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and transported her body to the location where she was found. His statements provided investigators with a direct account of the crime from the man they believed responsible. But the confession did not stand alone. It was supported by the DNA evidence that had led investigators to him in the first place. The investigation had now created a powerful sequence. First came the old biological evidence. Then came genetic genealogy. Then came the identification of a possible suspect. Then came direct DNA confirmation. Then came the arrest. Finally, according to the affidavit, came the confession. The entire chain stretched across 30 years. It was almost as if to separate eras of investigation had been joined together. The first era began with April's murder and ended with an unidentified DNA profile. The second began when modern genetic genealogy gave investigators a way to search beyond traditional databases. Between them was an enormous gap of time, but the evidence bridged that gap. This is what made the case so important. It showed that a cold case can remain active even when there are no visible developments. The public may hear nothing for years, but investigators can preserve evidence and wait for new methods. Science does not move according to the schedule of a criminal investigation. A technique may not exist when a crime occurs. A database may not exist. A new algorithm may not have been invented. Years later, those limitations can disappear. The evidence remains the same, but its usefulness changes. April's case demonstrated exactly that. The DNA profile did not suddenly become stronger in 2018. What changed was the ability to connect it with distant relatives. That connection created the pathway investigators needed. The breakthrough also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence in old investigations. If biological material had been lost or degraded beyond use, the genetic genealogy investigation might never have happened. The case could have remained unresolved. Instead, evidence survived long enough to become useful in an entirely new era of forensic science. For April's family, the scientific breakthrough was never merely scientific. It was personal. They had spent 30 years without knowing who was responsible. They had lived through an entire generation of uncertainty. The arrest brought an answer, but it also forced them to confront the details of April's final moments. The truth was painful, yet uncertainty had been painful too. There is no perfect way to end a murder investigation. The best outcome is accountability and truth, but neither can restore the life that was lost. April was still 8 years old. Her family could never see the woman she might have become. The investigation could only establish what happened and who was responsible. In that sense, the DNA breakthrough was both powerful and limited. It could identify the killer. It could not undo the murder. It could bring the case to court. It could not bring April home. It could give the family a name. It could not give them another birthday with her. Those limitations are often hidden behind dramatic headlines about cold cases being solved. The headline says, "The mystery is over." But for the family, solving the mystery does not mean forgetting the victim. It means finally knowing the truth about what happened. Miller's arrest was followed by criminal charges. He initially pleaded not guilty, and the possibility of a trial remained. Prosecutors had to prepare a case built around evidence more than 3 decades old. The DNA would be central. The genetic genealogy process would have to be explained. Miller's statements would become part of the prosecution's evidence. The communications and biological material associated with them would add historical context. The prosecution therefore possessed something rare in an old case: multiple layers of evidence that supported one another. The defense could challenge individual elements, but the investigation was no longer based on one fragile clue. It was a network of evidence built over time. Then, in December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty. The plea changed the course of the case. There would be no lengthy trial requiring the family to relive every detail before a jury. Instead, Miller admitted guilt. Later that month, he received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence ensured that he would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. The legal system had finally delivered a definitive answer. The man who had remained hidden for 30 years was now formally held responsible. The investigation was no longer a cold case. It was a solved murder, but the legacy of the case reached beyond the courtroom. April Tinsley's murder became a symbol of what modern genetic genealogy could accomplish. Investigators across the United States began reconsidering old cases with unidentified DNA profile. Families who had waited decades began asking whether their loved ones might also be identified. The idea that an offender could remain outside traditional criminal databases but still be reached through genetic relatives changed the way investigators thought about unidentified suspects. Yet that power came with difficult ethical questions. Genetic information belongs to real people. Relatives may have provided DNA for ancestry research, not criminal investigations. The use of those connections required careful consideration. The science was powerful precisely because human beings are genetically connected. That same power demanded responsibility. April's case stood at the center of this new era because it demonstrated both the promise and the complexity of the technique. A murder that had resisted identification for 3 decades had finally been solved. The killer had been named. The evidence had been confirmed. The offender had confessed and pleaded guilty. Justice had arrived, but late, very late. And perhaps that was the most haunting part of all. The killer had spent 30 years believing, whether consciously or not, that the passage of time separated him from the crime. But the evidence had remained connected to him. Time had not erased the biological trail. It had only delayed the moment when investigators could follow it. When they finally did, the trail led directly to John D. Miller. The secret had survived for 30 years. The evidence had survived with it. And when modern science finally opened the door, there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. The courtroom was now waiting for a story that had begun 3 decades earlier when April Tinsley was still a little girl and her disappearance turned a quiet part of Fort Wayne into the center of a desperate search. For years, investigators had carried the weight of that unanswered case. Now the evidence had finally led them to John D. Miller, and the legal system had to determine what would happen next. The arrest itself had been dramatic, but the most important work was no longer happening in the shadows. It was happening through documents, forensic examinations, interviews, and legal proceedings. Every detail had to be established. Every piece of evidence had to have a clear origin. Every statement had to be placed in context. The case had survived for 30 years, and now prosecutors had to make sure it would survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. Miller faced charges connected to April's murder, including murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. The accusations were extraordinarily serious, but the investigation had already produced something that many cold cases never obtain: a direct forensic connection between the suspect and evidence associated with the crime. The DNA was not discovered in the final months of the investigation. It had been preserved from the original investigation and later became the foundation of the genetic genealogy breakthrough. That history mattered. It showed that the investigation was not suddenly built around a new theory. It was built around evidence that had existed for decades. The revolutionary part, the method used to identify the person behind that evidence. Genetic genealogy had opened a door that traditional database searches could not. Investigators had moved backward through family relationships until Miller emerged as a person worthy of direct investigation. Then traditional DNA testing provided the confirmation. It was a chain that depended on patience. One weak link could have broken the entire process. A wrong genealogical connection could have sent investigators toward the wrong family. An unreliable biological sample could have produced uncertainty. A mistaken interpretation could have created a false lead. Instead, the pieces converged. The unknown male profile was connected to Miller. That connection gave investigators the confidence to confront him, and, according to the probable cause affidavit, his response during questioning became another remarkable moment. When detectives asked Miller if he knew why they wanted to speak with him, he named April. That response carried enormous significance because it suggested that he understood the precise reason for the investigation before detectives had to explain it. The investigators then presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually acknowledged his involvement in April's abduction, sexual assault, and murder, and described moving her body to the place where she was found. The case that had once depended almost entirely on what investigators could reconstruct from the outside now contained statements attributed to the man they believed responsible. But even with those statements, the physical evidence remained essential. A confession can be challenged. A statement can be disputed. Memory can be questioned. DNA provides a different kind of evidence because it is based on biological characteristics rather than recollection. The combination made the case particularly powerful. Investigators had not simply found someone who resembled a theory. They had followed the evidence to a specific individual and then obtained a direct forensic connection. The confession came after that connection had been established. The case, therefore, represented an evolution in investigative thinking. In the early years, detectives had worked outward from the crime, searching for people who might have seen something or known something. Decades later, investigators worked backward from DNA, using genetics to locate a family and then narrowing that family to an individual. Two completely different investigative approaches had eventually arrived at the same place. The passage of time had not erased the case. It had changed the tools available to solve it. For April's family, however, the scientific language could never completely describe what the breakthrough meant. Genetic genealogy might be explained through chromosomes, relatives, family trees, and probability, but the emotional reality was much simpler. For 30 years, they had not known the identity of the person responsible for April's death. Now they did. That knowledge could bring relief, but it could also bring anger, grief, and a renewed awareness of everything that had been lost. April had been 8 years old in 1988. When investigators arrested Miller in 2018, she would have been 38. That mathematical contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. The child in the photographs had remained 8 forever, while the world around her had continued changing. People who had known her grew older. Streets changed. Technology changed. Investigators changed. The city changed. But April's image remained frozen in time. The discovery of her killer did not change that image. It only changed the final chapter of her story. The case also raised a question that investigators around the country were beginning to ask. How many other unidentified offenders were hiding behind old DNA profiles? If genetic genealogy could identify the unknown person in April's case after 30 years, perhaps other families could receive the same breakthrough. The possibility was extraordinary. For decades, investigators had often been forced to wait for a suspect to enter a traditional database. Genetic genealogy created another route. The offender did not necessarily have to submit his own DNA. A relative might unknowingly provide the connection. That meant the traditional idea of an offender being outside the system was changing. A person could avoid arrest, avoid giving a sample, and still leave a genetic trail through relatives. This did not make genetic genealogy infallible. It did not eliminate the need for traditional investigation. It did not turn every cold case into an automatic solution. But it changed what was possible. April's case demonstrated the potential with unusual clarity. The investigation had reached a dead end in one era and found a pathway in another. Meanwhile, the legal process continued. Miller initially pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for a possible trial. A trial would have required prosecutors to present the evidence in detail. Experts would have been expected to explain the DNA evidence and the genealogy process. Investigators would have described how Miller became a suspect. The history of the case would have been placed before the court. For April's family, that could have meant hearing the painful story of her murder all over again in a public courtroom. But the case did not ultimately require a full trial. Miller changed his plea. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty to the charges associated with April's murder. The guilty plea was a decisive moment because it removed the uncertainty of a jury verdict. The person investigators had identified through genetic genealogy was now admitting responsibility in court. The 30-year investigation had reached its legal conclusion. Later that month, Miller was sentenced to 80 years in prison, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence represented the final judgment of the court. After 3 decades of uncertainty, the case had an official ending. But an ending in the legal system does not necessarily mean an ending for the people who lived with the crime. April's family still had to carry the loss. Friends and members of the community still had to remember what had happened. The investigators who had worked the case still had to process the fact that a mystery they had inherited from another generation had finally been solved, and the wider public was left confronting an uncomfortable truth. The person responsible had been able to lie for decades without being identified. The case demonstrated how easily an unresolved crime can become part of the background of a community. Time can make an unsolved murder feel distant. New generations may know only a name, a photograph, or a headline, but for the people closest to the victim, the passage of time does not make the loss disappear. It simply changes the shape of the grief. The eventual arrest also showed why cold case investigators continue returning to old evidence. A case that seems exhausted may still contain information that has not yet been fully understood. A biological sample can sit in storage for years. A photograph can remain in a file. A witness statement can become meaningful when combined with new information. Technology can transform a clue that once seemed useless into something decisive. That was exactly what happened here. The DNA did not suddenly appear in 2018. It had been there. The genetic relationship did not magically reveal the killer's identity without work. Investigators had to construct the path. The arrest was the result of combining old evidence with new science. The story therefore became larger than the identification of one offender. It became a demonstration of how investigations can cross generations. A detective in one era may collect evidence without knowing how another detective decades later will use it. A laboratory may preserve a sample whose significance will only become clear when technology advances. A family may wait for an answer long after the original investigators have retired. And somewhere in the future, a new method may reopen a door that everyone thought had been permanently closed. April's case was one of those doors. It had remained closed for 30 years. Then, suddenly, it opened. Behind it was not a mysterious stranger without a name. It was a specific man whose genetic connection could be established through evidence preserved from the original investigation. The breakthrough did not happen because the past had changed. It happened because the present finally possessed the tools to understand the past. That distinction is what makes the case so haunting. For decades, the killer's identity had seemed inaccessible. The mystery appeared to belong to another time, but the evidence had been patiently waiting in the present. It had survived every year that passed. It had survived changes in technology and investigative personnel. It had survived the fading of public attention. And when investigators finally discovered how to follow the genetic trail, the distance between 1988 and 2018 collapsed. 30 years became a single chain of evidence. A child who had vanished from her family's life was no longer attached only to a cold case file. Her name became connected to a solved murder investigation and a final legal judgment. Yet the most powerful legacy was not the name of the offender. It was the reminder that the victim had never disappeared from the investigation. April's name had remained at the center of the case for 30 years. Every detective who reopened the file was ultimately searching for the same thing, an answer for a little girl whose life had been taken before she could grow up. The arrest could not restore those lost years. The sentence could not change history, but the truth could finally stand where uncertainty had stood for a generation. And that truth had been carried forward by something no one could see, something that had remained hidden inside the evidence until science finally gave it a voice. The guilty plea brought the legal chapter of April Tinsley's murder toward its conclusion. But the investigation itself had already become something much larger than the arrest of one man. It had become a story about time, evidence, technology, and the extraordinary persistence of a case that refused to disappear. For 3 decades, April's name had remained attached to an unanswered question. Who killed her? The question had survived changes in police departments, changes in forensic science, and changes in the lives of the people who remembered her. Then, almost impossibly, the answer emerged from a trail of DNA that had been waiting since the 1980s. What made the breakthrough so powerful was the contrast between the beginning and the end. In 1988, investigators were working in a world without the forensic tools that would eventually make genetic genealogy possible. In 2018, investigators could examine the same biological evidence through an entirely different scientific lens. The evidence had not become new. The technology had. That difference transformed everything. When April disappeared, the immediate priority was finding her. The search was urgent because every passing hour mattered. Investigators and members of the community were confronted with the terrifying reality that a child was missing. Then the search ended in tragedy. April was found dead, and the investigation entered a completely different phase. Detectives had to identify a killer who had managed to leave investigators with a biological trail, but no name. The profile became one of the most important pieces of the case, but without a matching person, it could only tell investigators that an unknown male was connected to the evidence. The word unknown became the wall that investigators could not break through. They could test, they could compare, they could preserve, but they could not identify. Then came the communications that would deepen the mystery. Someone connected to the case sent messages that attracted the attention of investigators. The communications appeared to demonstrate knowledge of April's murder, and biological material associated with them was connected to the same unknown male DNA profile. For detectives, this was both disturbing and significant. It suggested that the person responsible might still be somewhere in the world, living an ordinary life while knowing that investigators had never stopped searching. Yet the biological evidence remained anonymous. There was still no name. Years passed. The case entered the category that every investigator hates to use: cold. But the word was misleading. The evidence was not cold. The DNA was still there. The file was still there. April's name was still there. What had gone cold was the trail to the identity. The case had reached a point where traditional investigation could not move it forward. Then forensic science began changing the rules. Genetic genealogy emerged as a new investigative possibility. Instead of requiring a direct match between the unknown DNA profile and a known suspect, investigators could search for genetic relative. The strategy was fundamentally different. A relative might not know anything about the crime. The person might never have met the offender. The relative might live in another state or belong to a completely different branch of the family, but shared genetic material could create a pathway. Investigators could follow that pathway through genealogical records and family trees. The process demanded enormous patience. It required separating useful connections from irrelevant ones. It required reconstructing generations of relationships and determining which branches could realistically contain the unknown offender. Eventually, the research pointed toward the Miller family. John D. Miller emerged as a possible suspect. For the first time in 30 years, investigators had a name, but they still needed proof. The importance of that distinction cannot be overstated. Genetic genealogy is an investigative tool. It can point detectives toward a person, but it does not automatically prove that person committed a crime. Investigators therefore sought direct DNA confirmation. Biological material associated with Miller was obtained and tested. The result connected Miller to the DNA profile that had been preserved from the investigation. The unknown male had become identifiable. The name John D. Miller was no longer simply a genealogical possibility. It was connected to the biological evidence. The case had finally crossed the line from speculation to forensic identification. In July 2018, Miller was arrested. The announcement carried a strange sense of unreality. 30 years had passed since April's murder. People who had once followed the case closely were now older. Some had families of their own. Some had moved away. Some may have believed they would never hear an answer. Then suddenly the investigation was back in the news. Detectives had a suspect. The suspect had a DNA connection, and investigators were about to confront him. According to the probable cause affidavit, detectives asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. His response was immediate. He named April. That moment became one of the most striking details in the entire investigation because detectives did not have to tell him which case they were discussing. He already knew. The investigators then presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted to abducting April, sexually assaulting her, killing her, and transporting her body to the location where she was found. The admission gave investigators another layer of evidence, but the DNA remained the foundation of the identification. It was the evidence that had survived the decades and ultimately led detectives to Miller. The confession also provided an important reminder of how cold cases can evolve. At the beginning, investigators often have to work without the offender's cooperation. They reconstruct events from physical evidence and witness accounts. If the offender is eventually identified, the investigation can change dramatically. Detectives can ask questions that could not be answered before. They can confront inconsistencies. They can compare statements with physical evidence. They can seek explanations for details that once had no context. In April's case, investigators finally had the person they believed responsible sitting across from them. For the first time, the unknown male was no longer a shadow in a laboratory report. He was a living suspect. The legal process then moved forward. Miller faced serious charges, including murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. Initially, he pleaded not guilty. The possibility of a trial remained, and a trial could have forced the evidence into the public spotlight in painful detail. Prosecutors would have had to explain the genetic genealogy process and establish the reliability of the DNA comparison. Investigators would have had to describe how the evidence had been preserved. The case would have required the past to be reconstructed in a courtroom decades after the crime occurred. For April's family, that prospect must have been difficult to contemplate. A trial can provide accountability, but it can also require victims' families to hear the most painful details of a crime again and again. Instead, Miller eventually pleaded guilty in December 2018. His guilty plea brought a different kind of finality. There would be no need for a lengthy jury trial. The defendant acknowledged responsibility, and the court could proceed directly to sentencing. Later that month, Miller received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence formally closed the legal chapter of the case. After 30 years, the investigation had reached a point that once seemed impossible. The offender had been identified. He had been arrested. He had admitted responsibility. He had pleaded guilty. He had been sentenced. Yet for April's family, the word closure could never completely describe what happened. Closure can suggest that grief has an ending. It does not. The legal uncertainty ended. The grief did not. April remained the little girl whose life had been taken in 1988. Her family could finally answer the question of who was responsible, but they could never recover the decades that followed her death. They could never know the adult she might have become. They could never create the ordinary memories that should have filled those years. The sentence could punish the offender, but it could not restore the future that April had lost. That reality is often hidden behind the dramatic phrase, "cold case solved." A headline can make a decades-old investigation sound like a puzzle that has finally been completed, but human lives are not puzzles. They are interrupted. When the case is solved, the interruption remains. The significance of the investigation therefore lies not only in the arrest, but also in what it demonstrated about the possibility of finding answers after decades. April's case became an example of how old evidence can acquire new power. A DNA profile that once stopped at an unknown male could eventually be connected to a family. That family could lead to a suspect. A direct comparison could establish the forensic connection, and traditional investigation could complete the picture. The process was not magic. It was science combined with patience. It was evidence preserved long enough for technology to catch up. That idea would resonate far beyond Fort Wayne. Families across the country began wondering whether their own unsolved cases might contain similar possibilities. Police agencies began reviewing old evidence. Genetic genealogy became one of the most discussed developments in modern cold case investigation. But its power also raised difficult questions about privacy and the use of genetic information. The same technology capable of identifying a killer could reveal family relationships that people never expected investigators to explore. The debate would continue, But April's case had already demonstrated what the technology could accomplish when investigators had an unidentified DNA profile and nowhere else to turn. The case also revealed something more unsettling about the passage of time. Time can create the illusion that an offender has escaped the past. Decades can pass. People can change jobs, move, build families, grow older, and become almost invisible beneath the ordinary routines of life. But physical evidence does not experience time in the same way. A biological profile does not forget. A preserved sample does not decide that the case is too old. Evidence waits. Sometimes it waits for years. Sometimes it waits for generations. And sometimes the technology required to understand it has not even been invented yet. That was the reality of April's case. The investigation had not failed because there was no evidence. It had stalled because the evidence could not yet reveal the identity hidden inside it. When the technology arrived, the old evidence became new again. And once investigators learned how to follow the genetic trail, the mystery that had survived 30 years began collapsing with astonishing speed. The killer had spent decades behind the protection of anonymity, but anonymity was never permanent. It was simply temporary. Somewhere inside a family tree, inside preserved biological material, inside a forensic profile created decades earlier, the connection remained. And eventually, investigators found it. The little girl whose murder had once seemed destined to remain an unsolved tragedy finally had a named offender. The community finally had an answer. And a case that had survived for 30 years had finally reached its end in court. But the most haunting truth remained unchanged. The evidence had been there from the beginning, silently waiting for someone to ask the right question. For decades, the name April Tinsley had carried two meanings at once. It was the name of a little girl whose life ended far too soon, and it was the name attached to a mystery that seemed incapable of producing an answer. After the arrest and guilty plea of John D. Miller, the mystery surrounding the identity of her killer was finally resolved, but the story of how that answer emerged remained extraordinary. The investigation had crossed from one era of forensic science into another, and the bridge between those eras was a piece of evidence that had refused to disappear. The DNA profile connected to April's case had survived for 30 years, waiting for technology to become capable of using it in a completely different way. In the beginning, investigators could only see the profile as belonging to an unknown male. They could compare it with other samples, but if there was no direct match, the trail stopped. There was no obvious suspect. There was no name. There was no database hit that could end the mystery. The profile was powerful evidence, but it was anonymous evidence. That distinction made the case so difficult. A forensic profile can tell investigators that two pieces of evidence belong to the same person, but it cannot always tell them who that person is. For April's investigators, that meant the biological evidence could confirm connections without providing an identity. Years passed with the answer trapped behind that limitation. Then, genetic genealogy changed the possibilities. Instead of requiring a direct match, investigators could search for relatives. That was the conceptual breakthrough. The unknown offender's DNA could potentially be connected to someone who had never been involved in the crime and might never have known that a distant relative was being sought by police. Investigators could use that genetic connection to reconstruct family relationships and gradually narrow the possibilities. The work was complicated and methodical. It required combining genetic data with genealogical records, tracing family lines across generations, identifying potential descendants, and comparing those people with the known facts of the investigation. Every branch had to be examined carefully. A genetic relationship could create a lead, but it could not establish guilt. Eventually, the investigation pointed toward the Miller family, and John D. Miller became the focus of investigators' attention. For a case that had spent 30 years without a name, even that development was extraordinary. But detectives knew that a name obtained through genealogy was only the beginning. They needed direct forensic confirmation. Biological material connected to Miller was obtained and compared with the DNA profile from the case. The result provided the confirmation investigators had been waiting for. Miller's DNA matched the profile associated with the evidence. The unknown male was no longer unknown. A 30-year-old forensic mystery had been transformed into an identifiable suspect. The breakthrough also gave new meaning to the biological evidence associated with communications that had emerged during the years after April's murder. Those communications had been disturbing because they appeared to come from someone who knew about the case. Biological material associated with them was connected to the same male DNA profile. For investigators, the connection was significant because it demonstrated continuity. The same unknown biological identity appeared in more than one aspect of the investigation. Yet, until Miller was identified, that continuity remained anonymous. Once the genetic genealogy investigation pointed toward him and direct testing confirmed the match, those old pieces of evidence became part of a much larger picture. The past suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. The evidence was no longer a collection of isolated clues. It was a connected trail leading to one person. The arrest followed in July 2018. For many people in Fort Wayne, the announcement must have felt almost impossible to believe. 30 years had passed. The case had become part of local memory. People had learned to live with the fact that April's killer was unknown. Now, the person investigators believed responsible was in custody. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to confrontation. Detectives could finally ask questions directly. According to the probable cause affidavit, they asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him. He named April. That moment was striking because investigators did not need to introduce the subject before Miller recognized it. Then they presented the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller eventually admitted to abducting April, sexually assaulting her, killing her, and transporting her body to the location where she was found. The statement added another dimension to a case already supported by forensic evidence. The investigation had found the person connected to the biological profile, and now the person investigators had identified was acknowledging involvement. The legal process moved quickly compared with the 30 years that had preceded it. Miller was charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. He initially pleaded not guilty. The possibility of a trial remained, but the evidence would have been central regardless of how the case proceeded. Prosecutors had the DNA connection. They had the genealogy investigation. They had the statements attributed to Miller. They had the history of the case and the biological evidence associated with the investigation. The courtroom would have been the place where all of those pieces were assembled into a formal case. Instead, Miller eventually pleaded guilty in December 2018. The guilty plea was a dramatic turning point because it removed the uncertainty that accompanies a jury trial. Miller admitted responsibility. The court no longer needed to determine whether he was guilty through a contested trial. The case had reached a legal conclusion. Later that month, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence represented the final legal judgment in a case that had remained unresolved for 30 years. Yet the emotional impact did not end with sentencing. A family can wait decades for an arrest and still feel devastated when the arrest finally comes. The identity of the killer may answer one question while creating others. Why did this happen? How did the person remain unidentified for so long? What would April's life have looked like if she had survived? What memories might her family have made with her? Those questions cannot be answered by DNA. They exist outside the reach of forensic science. Investigators can establish facts. Courts can determine guilt. Sentences can impose punishment. But no technology can reconstruct the future that a murdered child never had. April remained 8 years old forever. That fact became even more striking when the killer was identified 3 decades later. The world had changed enormously during those years. Technology had advanced. Social attitudes had changed. People had grown older. Yet April's image remained frozen. The case, therefore, became a powerful reminder of the unequal passage of time between victims and offenders. The victim remains trapped at the moment of death. The offender continues living. That contrast can be painful for families of cold case victims. The identification of Miller did not erase that imbalance. It did, however, provide something that had been missing since 1988. Accountability. The case also became an important example for investigators studying the future of cold cases. Genetic genealogy had demonstrated that an unidentified offender could potentially be found without appearing in a traditional criminal DNA database. A relative could create the connection. That meant investigators could approach unidentified DNA profiles differently. Instead of waiting for the offender to make a mistake that would place him in a database, detectives could use the genetic structure of the population itself to trace relationships. It was a profound shift. Traditional investigation often moves from person to evidence. Genetic genealogy can move from evidence to family, then from family to person. The direction is reversed. That reversal was one of the reasons April's case attracted so much attention. The killer had not been caught because a witness suddenly remembered him. He had not been identified because he confessed voluntarily. He had been reached through a scientific pathway that investigators could not have used in 1988. The case also demonstrated why old evidence must be preserved carefully. If the biological material had been discarded, contaminated, or lost, the genetic genealogy breakthrough might never have happened. The evidence's survival was itself a form of investigative persistence. Detectives who worked the original case could not have known that scientists 30 years later would use methods they had never imagined. They could only do the best work possible with the tools available to them. That work became the foundation for the future. This is one of the most important lessons of cold cases. Investigators may not know which piece of evidence will eventually solve a crime. A seemingly minor biological sample can become decisive decades later. A photograph can acquire new significance. A witness statement can become useful when combined with new information. A case file can become a roadmap for investigators who were not even working in law enforcement when the crime occurred. Time changes people, but evidence can remain remarkably constant. In April's case, the biological evidence survived long enough for science to catch up. When it did, the unknown male profile became the central key. The family tree became the pathway. Miller became the suspect. The DNA comparison became the confirmation. His statements became another link. His guilty plea became the legal conclusion. The sequence was extraordinary because each stage depended on the previous one. Remove one step, and the case might have remained unresolved. That is why the breakthrough cannot be reduced to the phrase DNA solved the case. DNA was crucial, but the investigation required far more than a laboratory result. It required detectives who knew how to interpret the result, genealogists who could trace relationships, scientists who could perform the comparison, prosecutors who could present the evidence, and a legal system capable of delivering the final judgment. It was a collective process stretching across decades. The case also left behind a powerful question about the meaning of time in criminal investigations. 30 years can feel like an eternity. A child becomes a memory. A detective retires. A community changes. But evidence can wait without losing its identity. The killer may believe that the passage of time has buried the crime, yet the past can remain physically present in a laboratory freezer, inside a case file, or within a genetic profile. It can wait quietly until someone discovers how to interpret it. April's case proved that the past does not always stay buried. Sometimes it returns with extraordinary force. A DNA profile created decades earlier can suddenly point toward a family. A family tree can lead to a name. A name can lead to an arrest. An arrest can lead to an admission. And an admission can lead to a sentence. The chain can begin with something microscopic and end with a courtroom judgment. For April's family, the most important result was simple. They finally knew. The mystery that had surrounded her death for 30 years was no longer a mystery. Her killer had a name. The person responsible had been held accountable. The investigation had reached the answer everyone had been waiting for. But the case's final legacy would not be the disappearance of April from memory. It would be the opposite. Solving the case brought her name back into public attention, not as an anonymous victim in an unsolved file, but as the child at the center of an investigation that demonstrated the extraordinary power of evidence. April's story had survived because people refused to stop looking for the truth. And when the truth finally emerged, it came from a place no one could have fully understood in 1988. A genetic connection stretching across generations waiting for investigators to follow it. 30 years had passed, but the evidence had never forgotten. Neither had April's family, and neither ultimately had the investigation. The guilty plea had ended the courtroom uncertainty, but it could not end the questions that had followed. April Tinsley's murder for 30 years. The arrest of John D. Miller had answered the most important question, yet the case continued to reveal something deeper about how time can both conceal a crime and eventually expose it. For decades, the identity of April's killer had remained beyond the reach of investigators. Then, in a matter of months, a genetic trail transformed an anonymous DNA profile into the name of a man who would ultimately admit responsibility and receive a lengthy prison sentence. The speed of that final chapter stood in almost impossible contrast to the years of silence that came before it. April disappeared in 1988. The investigation began immediately. Evidence was collected, leads were pursued, the community searched for answers. Yet the central mystery remained intact. The biological evidence connected an unknown male to the investigation, but there was no direct identity. The profile could be compared, but it could not be named. Investigators were left with one of the most frustrating situations in forensic work, knowing that the answer existed somewhere in the evidence while being unable to reach it. The profile was a fingerprint of sorts, but it was a fingerprint without a person attached to it. The years that followed only deepened the mystery. April's murder became one of those cases that remained present even when it was no longer in the headlines. Cold cases rarely disappear completely. They become quieter. The file remains. Evidence remains. Names remain. Families continue remembering. Detectives sometimes return to the case when new information appears. But without a viable path forward, an investigation can remain dormant for years. April's case was different only because the evidence was unusually capable of surviving the passage of time. The biological material remained available. The unknown DNA profile remained useful, and then forensic science entered an era that offered investigators a new way to search for an identity. Genetic genealogy changed the direction of the investigation. Rather than waiting for the unknown offender to appear in a traditional law enforcement database, investigators could search for genetic relatives. This was a fundamental shift in strategy. The question was no longer, where is the suspect in the database? It became, who might be related to the person represented by this DNA? That question could open an entirely different investigative path. A distant relative could become the first thread. The thread could lead to a family. The family could lead to a branch. The branch could lead to a specific individual. The process required careful reconstruction. Genetic relationships alone were not enough. Investigators had to build genealogical connections and compare them with known facts. Eventually, the trail led toward John D. Miller. His name emerged as investigators narrowed the possibilities, but they still needed direct confirmation. That confirmation came through forensic DNA testing. Biological material connected to Miller was tested against the profile from April's case. The match provided the critical bridge between genealogy and traditional forensic evidence. Investigators now had more than a family connection. They had a direct biological connection. The unknown male had been identified. It was one of those rare moments in an investigation when decades of uncertainty collapse almost instantly. The person who had existed in the case file only as an unidentified profile now had a name. Miller's arrest in July 2018 marked the beginning of the final legal phase. Detectives could finally speak with the man whose DNA had been connected to the evidence. According to the probable cause affidavit, when investigators asked Miller if he knew why they wanted to speak with him, he identified April by name. Investigators then confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to the affidavit, Miller admitted to abducting April, sexually assaulting her, killing her, and moving her body to the place where she was found. His statements were deeply significant because they came after the forensic connection had already been established. The investigation had not simply found a man and asked him to explain a theory. It had found a genetic connection and then confronted the person connected to it. The biological evidence had opened the door. His statements provided another piece of the picture. The legal case therefore rested on a combination of evidence rather than a single revelation. This distinction matters because cold case investigations often become simplified in public memory. People may remember only the dramatic moment when a suspect is arrested. They may hear that genetic genealogy solved the crime and imagine that the identity appeared instantly. In reality, the process was far more complicated. Genetic genealogy provided an investigative lead. Traditional genealogy helped reconstruct family relationships. Detectives evaluated the potential suspect. Forensic scientists performed direct testing. Investigators then questioned Miller. Prosecutors prepared the case. Finally, the legal system reached a conclusion through a guilty plea and sentencing. Each stage depended on the previous one. The investigation was a chain, and the strength of the conclusion came from the convergence of those different methods. The case also demonstrated how valuable biological evidence can become when it is preserved. In 1988, no one could have predicted the future of genetic genealogy. The investigators working on April's case could not know that decades later, scientists would be able to use genetic relationships to identify an unknown offender. They could only preserve what they had. That simple act became crucial. The evidence survived long enough for technology to catch up. The case therefore became an example of something that is easy to overlook. Solving a cold case can depend as much on decisions made decades earlier as on technology available today. Someone had to collect the evidence. Someone had to document it. Someone had to preserve it. Someone had to keep the case alive. Without those steps, the breakthrough would never have happened. For April's family, the passage of time had been particularly cruel. April was 8 when she was murdered. 30 years later, the investigation finally produced a suspect. She would have been 38. That contrast is almost impossible to express without feeling the weight of everything that had been lost. A child should grow older. She should change. She should have memories that stretch across decades. She should become an adult with experiences, relationships, ambitions, disappointments, successes, and ordinary moments that no one notices because they are simply part of living. April never had any of them. Her photograph remained the image of an 8-year-old girl while the people around her grew older. That is one of the most painful realities of a long, unsolved murder. The victim's age becomes frozen while the investigation moves through time. The killer can grow older. Detectives can retire. Technology can evolve, but the victim remains exactly where the crime left them. When the killer was finally identified, that contrast became even more powerful. The person responsible had lived through 3 decades while April's life had been permanently interrupted. The legal system could punish him. It could not restore what he had taken. The guilty plea, therefore, represented accountability, not restoration. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty. Later that month, he received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence closed the legal chapter of the case, but the emotional chapter would continue for April's family and those who remembered her. The case had finally reached an official conclusion, yet the questions about what April's life might have become would never have answers. There was also another legacy emerging from the investigation. The use of genetic genealogy demonstrated that the future of cold case work could involve methods that investigators from previous generations could never have imagined. An unidentified DNA profile no longer necessarily meant an unidentified offender forever. The genetic structure of a family could become a map. The map could lead investigators toward a suspect. That possibility gave new hope to families whose cases had remained unresolved for decades. At the same time, it created difficult discussions about privacy and the use of genetic information. People provide DNA for many reasons. They may want to learn about ancestry. They may want to discover relatives. They may want to understand their family history. They do not necessarily expect their genetic relationships to become part of a criminal investigation. The same technology that can bring justice can also expose deeply personal connection. That tension would become one of the defining questions surrounding forensic genetic genealogy. But in April's case, there was no question about the importance of identifying the person responsible. The investigation had spent 3 decades without an answer. The breakthrough gave the family something they had never had: certainty about the identity of the killer. It also gave law enforcement a formal conclusion to one of the region's most haunting cold cases. The story became a reminder that the word unsolved should never necessarily mean forgotten. An unsolved case can remain active in ways the public cannot see. Evidence can be re-examined. New technologies can emerge. New investigators can approach old information differently. A case file that once seemed exhausted can become valuable again when viewed through a new scientific framework. That was exactly what happened to April's case. The DNA profile had not changed. The crime had not changed. April's story had not changed. The investigators' ability to interpret the evidence had changed. That difference was enough to transform the investigation. The killer had remained hidden behind an unknown profile for 30 years. Then investigators found a way to turn genetics into genealogy, genealogy into a family tree, and the family tree into a suspect. The suspect's DNA confirmed the connection. His statements provided additional evidence. His guilty plea brought the case into the legal record. His sentence provided the final punishment. The chain was complete. Yet there was something almost haunting about the fact that the breakthrough began with information that was invisible. There was no dramatic object discovered in a hidden room. No secret confession suddenly appeared from nowhere. No witness walked into a police station after 30 years with a perfect memory. The key was microscopic, biological, silent. It had been present all along, and that is why April's case became more than a story about one murder. It became a story about the persistence of evidence. Time had tried to bury the truth beneath decades of uncertainty, but the evidence remained. It waited while investigators changed. It waited while technology evolved. It waited while the public moved on. Then, when the right method finally arrived, the evidence began speaking in a language investigators could understand. And once it spoke, the silence that had surrounded April's murder for 30 years could not last forever. The years after the conviction did not erase the significance of what had happened. If anything, they made the breakthrough more important. April Tinsley's case had become a powerful demonstration of how a murder investigation could cross an entire generation and still find its way to the truth. In 1988, investigators had been forced to work with the limitations of their time. By 2018, those limitations had changed. The biological evidence that once seemed capable of identifying only an unknown male could now be connected to relatives through genetic genealogy, and that connection ultimately led investigators to John D. Miller. The arrest was shocking. The guilty plea was decisive. The sentence was final. But the real story of the case was the chain connecting those moments. For 30 years, April's family had lived with an unanswered question. Who had done this? That question had followed them through birthdays that April never reached, through anniversaries that marked the passage of time, through decades in which technology changed almost beyond recognition. Yet one thing did not change. April remained at the center of the investigation. Her name remained in the case file. Her photographs remained part of the record. Her story remained known to investigators who refused to let the case disappear completely. That persistence mattered because cold cases depend on memory. Evidence can survive in laboratories, but investigations also survive because someone remembers why the evidence mattered. A detective may inherit a case from another detective. A new investigator may open an old file and discover details that previous generations could not use. A forensic scientist may revisit a biological sample with methods that did not exist when it was collected. The case moves through time, carried forward by people who may never have known the victim personally. April's investigation followed that pattern. The original evidence became the foundation for a future that no one could have predicted. The DNA profile was perhaps the most important example. In the 1980s, DNA testing was still developing. Investigators could use biological evidence in powerful ways, but the modern ecosystem of databases, genealogical records, and advanced forensic analysis had not yet emerged. The unknown profile therefore remained an identifier without a name. It could tell investigators that a particular biological source was present. It could connect evidence, but it could not tell them where that person lived or what his name was. That limitation defined the case for decades. Then genetic genealogy changed the question. Investigators no longer needed to ask whether Miller himself had already appeared in a criminal database. They could ask whether the DNA was genetically related to someone who had appeared in a genealogical database. That was a completely different strategy. It transformed the investigation from a search for a direct match into a search for a family connection. Once investigators had a genetic relationship, they could use traditional genealogical research to build a family tree. The tree became a map. Somewhere on that map was the person whose DNA had been left behind decades earlier. The process eventually pointed toward Miller. But even then, detectives did not simply accept the genealogical result as proof. They obtained biological material associated with Miller and performed direct DNA testing. The match confirmed the connection. That scientific confirmation was critical because it transformed the genealogy from a lead into a forensic link. The unknown male profile had a name. That name belonged to John D. Miller. His arrest in July 2018 brought the investigation into public view once again. People who had followed the case for decades suddenly saw a photograph of the man authorities believed responsible. The shock was not simply that someone had been arrested. It was that the arrest came after 30 years of silence. The killer had remained unidentified through an entire generation. Then modern science reached backward and found him. According to the probable cause affidavit, investigators asked Miller whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him, and he identified April. After being confronted with the DNA evidence, he eventually admitted to abducting her, sexually assaulting her, killing her, and moving her body to where she was found. Those statements became part of the evidence that prosecutors could use in the case. Yet the DNA connection remained central because it had been established independently of the confession. This was important from an investigative perspective. A confession can provide details, but a forensic match provides an objective connection between an individual and biological evidence together. The evidence created a much stronger case than either element could have created alone. The legal proceedings continued. Miller initially pleaded not guilty, but the case never reached the kind of full trial that many people might have expected after such a long investigation. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty. The plea brought an extraordinary investigation to its legal conclusion. Later that month, he received an 80-year sentence, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. For investigators, it was the moment when the case that had consumed decades could finally be placed in the category of solved. For April's family, however, the word solved carried a complicated meaning. It meant they finally knew who was responsible. It meant there was accountability. It meant the person who had caused the devastation in 1988 had been identified and sentenced. But it did not mean the loss had ended. Nothing could make April 8 years old again. Nothing could restore the future that had been taken from her. Nothing could give her family the decades they had been forced to imagine rather than live. That is the difficult truth behind almost every cold case resolution. The investigation can reach an end. The grief does not necessarily follow the same schedule. The sentence can be measured in years. The loss cannot. The case also became part of a larger transformation in law enforcement. Genetic genealogy was no longer simply an obscure scientific concept. It had become a tool capable of changing investigations that had remained frozen for decades. April's case demonstrated how the technique could work when traditional methods had reached their limit. It also showed why old evidence must be protected. Investigators in 1988 could not have known that a future generation would use genetic relationships to identify a suspect. They could not predict the existence of modern genealogy databases or the techniques used to analyze distant relatives. Their responsibility was simply to collect and preserve the evidence as carefully as possible. That decision became enormously important decades later. The evidence was waiting. The technology eventually arrived. The two met at the right moment. This is why the case continues to resonate. It was not a miracle. It was a sequence of decisions and discoveries made by people separated by years. Someone collected biological evidence. Someone preserved it. Someone later developed a genetic profile. Someone recognized the potential of genetic genealogy. Someone reconstructed the family relationships. Someone identified Miller as a potential suspect. Someone obtained a sample. A laboratory confirmed the DNA match. Detectives made the arrest. Prosecutors built the case. Miller pleaded guilty. A judge imposed the sentence. Each step mattered. Remove any one of them, and the outcome might have been different. The case, therefore, became a lesson in investigative persistence. A cold case does not always require a brand new piece of evidence. Sometimes it requires a new way of understanding evidence that already exists. That distinction is crucial. When people hear that a decades-old murder has been solved, they often imagine a sudden discovery. In reality, the breakthrough may come from re-examining what investigators already knew. Technology can change the meaning of an old clue. Genetic genealogy did exactly that. The biological profile had always been there. What changed was the ability to connect it to a family. The family connection created a path to Miller. The direct DNA comparison confirmed it. Suddenly, evidence that had been anonymous for 30 years had a name attached to it. The case also forced people to reconsider the meaning of anonymity. Miller had not necessarily been protected by the absence of evidence. He had been protected by the inability to connect the evidence to him. That is a very different thing. The DNA existed, the connection did not. Once the connection was created, decades of anonymity collapsed. This is one of the most unsettling lessons of modern forensic science. A person may believe that time has erased the trail, but biological evidence can remain remarkably persistent. Technology may eventually find a way to connect it. For April's family, the most important consequence was that the unknown person who had haunted their lives was no longer unknown. There was a name. There was an arrest. There was an admission. There was a sentence. The uncertainty that had shaped 3 decades of their lives had finally been replaced by a painful certainty. That certainty could never bring April back, but it could answer the question that had remained unanswered since 1988. And perhaps that is why the story continues to matter. April was not simply the subject of an old police file. She was a child whose life should have continued. The investigation became a promise that her death would not become just another forgotten case. The people who continued working toward the answer were not able to change the past. They could only refuse to let the past disappear. 30 years after April's murder, the evidence finally produced the identity investigators had been searching for. The secret was exposed not through luck, but through persistence and science. The killer had remained hidden behind an unknown DNA profile. The profile had remained hidden behind the limitations of its era, and when those limitations finally disappeared, the identity emerged. The case had crossed from 1988 into 2018, carrying the same evidence through both eras. By the time the legal proceedings ended, the question that had haunted April's family for 30 years had finally been answered. But the most haunting part remained the simplest. The evidence had never forgotten. It had been there from the beginning, waiting silently in the background while the world moved forward. And when investigators finally learned how to follow it, it led them to the man whose name had been missing from April's story for 3 decades.